Lord, in moments when the weight of life feels heavy and uncertainty presses against our hearts, we choose to lean into your presence rather than our fears. We come before you, not pretending to be strong, but trusting that you are stronger than anything we face. Your word in Proverbs 3:5 reminds us to trust in you with all our heart, and not rely on our own understanding. When understanding fails us, your faithfulness remains unshaken and steady. Even when circumstances feel unstable, you are the same yesterday, today and forever. You see the full picture while we only see fragments of the moment we are in. Because of this truth, we declare with confidence that everything will be fine in your hand. Father, when our minds race with questions and our hearts grow tired from waiting, you invite us to rest in your promises instead of our worries. Isaiah 41:10 speaks directly to our fear by reminding us not to be afraid, because you are with us and you uphold us with your righteous right hand. You never ask us to carry tomorrow's burdens today. You never abandon us in seasons of difficulty or silence. Even when the path ahead feels unclear, your guidance never leaves us. You are working even when we cannot see the evidence yet. Trust becomes our anchor when answers are delayed. If this message speaks to your heart, pause right now and write "I trust God" in the comments. And also write your personal prayer request so we can stand with you in faith. Lord, you remind us that peace is not found in the absence of trouble, but in the presence of unwavering trust in you. Philippians 4:6-7 teaches us to bring everything to you in prayer, and in return you guard our hearts with peace beyond understanding. This peace does not depend on circumstances changing overnight. It settles our spirit even while storms remain. It quiets anxious thoughts that once felt overwhelming. It steadies our emotions when life feels unpredictable. Your peace becomes evidence that you are near. Because you are near, fear loses its grip. Father, when discouragement whispers that things will never improve, your word speaks louder truth over our lives. Romans 8:28 assures us that you work all things together for good, for those who love you and are called according to your purpose. Even what feels broken now is not wasted in your hands. Even delays are shaping us, protecting us, and preparing us. What feels like silence is often divine alignment, taking place behind the scenes. You are never late, never careless, and never absent. Trusting you means believing that the outcome is already covered by your wisdom. Because you are faithful, everything will be fine. Lord, there are days when trusting you feels easy, and days when it feels like a conscious choice we must make again and again. Psalm 46:1 declares that you are our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. You are not distant from our struggles or unaware of our tears. You stand close when life feels overwhelming and unpredictable. You do not measure our faith by perfection, but by surrender. Every time we choose trust over fear, we grow stronger in you. Even small acts of faith move mountains in the spiritual realm. Father, you know the specific battles each heart listening to this is facing right now. Some are carrying financial pressure that feels relentless. Some are carrying emotional pain that words cannot fully express. Some are waiting for healing, direction or restoration that seems delayed. Yet you see every detail and every silent prayer. Psalm 34:19 reminds us that though the righteous face many troubles, you deliver them from them all. Deliverance may not always be immediate, but it is always certain in your timing. Because you are our deliverer, we trust you fully. Lord, you teach us that faith is not denying reality, but declaring that you are greater than reality. Hebrews 11:1 reminds us that faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. We may not see how things will resolve, but we see who you are. We may not understand the process, but we trust the one guiding it. You have carried us through difficulties before, and you will do it again. Every testimony begins with a moment where trust was required before victory appeared. We choose to trust you again today. Father, when fear tries to take control of our thoughts, you offer us truth to replace it. 2 Timothy 1:7 reminds us that you have not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. Fear loses authority when truth is believed deeply. Our minds do not have to spiral into worst-case scenarios. Our hearts do not have to live in constant worry. We are allowed to breathe, to rest, and to trust. You stabilize our thinking and guard our emotions. In you, our thoughts become anchored in hope. Lord, trusting you also means releasing control over outcomes we cannot manage. Psalm 55:22 invites us to cast our burdens on you, knowing you will sustain us. We were never meant to carry everything alone. You never expected us to have all the answers. You simply ask us to place our trust in you one step at a time. Surrender is not weakness, it is wisdom. When we let go, you step in with strength and clarity. Trust allows us to move forward without fear of collapse. Father, even in seasons when progress feels slow, you are still moving us forward. Isaiah 40:31 promises that those who wait on you will renew their strength and rise again. Waiting is not wasted time when it is anchored in trust. You are restoring energy, clarity, and courage in the waiting. You are preparing us for what lies ahead, even when we cannot see it yet. Trust transforms waiting into growth. Strength rises quietly within us. Hope becomes steady rather than fragile. Lord, remind every heart listening that trust does not mean the absence of struggle, but the presence of assurance. John 16:33 reminds us that although we will face trouble in this world, we can have peace because you have overcome it. Victory does not begin at the finish line, but at the moment we choose trust. You have already gone ahead of us. You have already secured the outcome. You have already made a way where we see none. Because you overcame, we do not walk in defeat. We walk in confidence. Father, trusting you also heals the emotional weight we carry quietly. Psalm 147:3 tells us that you heal the broken-hearted and bind up their wounds. You do not rush healing, but you are faithful in it. You are gentle with fragile hearts. You restore what life has worn down over time. Even pain becomes a place where your comfort flows. Trust allows healing to unfold without pressure. You rebuild us from the inside out. Nothing in our hearts is hidden from you. Lord, you remind us that our future is not shaped by fear but by faith. Jeremiah 29:11 declares that your plans are for hope and a future, not harm. Our past mistakes do not cancel your promises. Our present struggles do not disqualify our future. You are writing a story that includes redemption, restoration, and peace. Trust allows us to look forward without dread. Hope becomes reasonable again. We believe that good is still coming. Everything will be fine because you are in control. Father, when our strength feels limited, you remain unlimited. 2 Corinthians 12:9 reminds us that your grace is sufficient and your power is made perfect in weakness. We do not need to pretend to be strong when we are not. You meet us exactly where we are. You supply what we lack. Weakness becomes the place where your strength shines brightest. Trust allows us to depend on you fully. You never fail to sustain us. Lord, trusting you also frees us from the fear of tomorrow. Matthew 6:34 reminds us not to worry about tomorrow, because each day has enough concerns of its own. You are already present in the future we fear. You are already preparing provision, protection, and peace ahead of us. We do not need to rush or panic. Trust slows our breathing and steadies our hearts. Today is enough when we place it in your hands. Tomorrow will also be covered. Father, remind us that you are close to those who trust you. Psalm 25:1 declares that those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be shaken. Even when storms surround us, we remain standing. Our foundation is not fragile because it rests on you. Circumstances may shift, but our trust keeps us stable. Fear loses its voice. When trust is firm, we stand unshaken because you are faithful. Everything will be fine because we are rooted in you. Lord, as trust deepens, peace naturally follows. Colossians 3:15 encourages us to let the peace of Christ rule in our hearts. Peace becomes the decision maker instead of fear. Calm replaces panic. Confidence replaces doubt. We are no longer driven by worst-case thinking. We are guided by truth and assurance. Trust creates room for peace to reign. Rest becomes possible again. Father, trusting you also renews our courage. Joshua 1:9 reminds us to be strong and courageous, because you are with us wherever we go. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward anyway. You walk beside us through every uncertain step. We are not walking into the unknown alone. Your presence goes before us and remains behind us. Trust gives us boldness to continue. We move forward with confidence. Lord, we declare that anxiety does not define our future. Psalm 107 reminds us that those who trust you will not fear bad news because their hearts are steadfast. Steadfast hearts are built on trust, not circumstance. We do not crumble under pressure. We remain anchored in truth. Fear does not dominate our decisions. Trust strengthens our inner resolve. Everything will be fine because our hearts are firm in you. Father, when life feels overwhelming, remind us that you invite us to come to you for rest. Matthew 11:28 assures us that you give rest to the weary. Rest is not escape, it is renewal. You restore our strength when we pause in your presence. You refill what stress has drained. Trust allows us to stop striving and start resting. Peace flows naturally when we surrender. You are our place of rest. Lord, trusting you also protects our minds from constant worry. Isaiah 26:3 promises perfect peace to those whose minds are stayed on you. Our focus determines our peace. When we focus on fear, anxiety grows. When we focus on you, peace settles in. Trust trains our thoughts to return to truth. Our minds become calm rather than restless. Stability replaces chaos. Everything will be fine because our focus remains on you. Father, as trust grows, hope becomes stronger. Romans 15:13 reminds us that you fill us with joy and peace as we trust in you. Joy does not require perfect circumstances. Peace does not depend on everything being resolved. Trust opens the door for both. Our spirits lift even before answers arrive. Hope becomes a steady companion. We move forward, encouraged. You are faithful. Lord, trusting you means believing that nothing we face is bigger than you. Psalm 27 reminds us that some trust in chariots and horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. Our confidence is not in resources or people alone. It is in you who never fails. You remain reliable when everything else shifts. Trust anchors us in eternal strength. We do not walk alone. Everything will be fine. Father, remind every heart that trust is a daily choice, not a one-time decision. Lamentations 3:22-3 reminds us that your mercies are new every morning. Each day brings fresh grace. Each moment offers renewed strength. We do not rely on yesterday's trust alone. We choose it again today. You meet us every time we choose faith. You remain faithful always. Lord, as this encouragement settles into every heart, we rest in the truth that you are in control. Psalm 37:5 encourages us to commit our way to you and trust you to act. We release what we cannot control. We surrender outcomes to your wisdom. We trust that you are working for our good. Even now, peace fills our hearts as we rely on you. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, there are moments when trusting you feels like walking forward without seeing the full path. Yet your word assures us that you guide every step we take. Psalm 37:23 reminds us that the steps of the righteous are ordered by you, even when the destination is unclear. You do not ask us to see the whole picture, only to keep walking with you. When uncertainty tries to slow us down, Your presence keeps us moving. You never misguide those who place their confidence in you. Even pauses and delays are part of your divine ordering. Trust allows us to move forward without fear of missing what you have prepared. Father, when our hearts feel heavy from waiting and answers seem distant, you invite us to lean deeper into your promises. Habakkuk 2:3 teaches us that your vision awaits its appointed time and will not fail. Waiting does not mean you have forgotten us. Silence does not mean you are inactive. You are working with precision beyond our awareness. Trust grows strongest in seasons where patience is required. You refine our faith while we wait. Everything unfolds according to your perfect timing. Lord, you remind us that trusting you brings rest, even in the middle of uncertainty. Psalm 62:1 declares that our souls find rest in you alone. Rest does not come from having every answer. Rest comes from knowing who holds the answer. When anxiety tries to disturb our peace, your presence settles our hearts. You invite us to release tension and rely on your strength. Trust quiets the noise of worry. Peace becomes our posture. Father, many hearts listening are carrying silent fears about the future. Yet you already stand in that future with authority and grace. Isaiah 46:10 reminds us that you declare the end from the beginning. Nothing ahead will surprise you. Nothing will overpower your will. You are not reacting to events. You are governing them. Trust allows us to face tomorrow without dread. Confidence grows when we remember who goes before us. Everything will be fine because you are already there. Lord, trusting you also reshapes how we see hardship. James 1:2-3 teaches us that trials test our faith and produce endurance. Difficulty does not mean failure. Pressure does not mean abandonment. Growth often begins where comfort ends. You are strengthening our inner foundation through what feels challenging now. Trust allows us to endure without losing hope. Endurance shapes maturity. You are building something lasting within us. Father, when disappointment tries to convince us that things are falling apart, you remind us that you are bringing things together. Psalm 66:10 speaks of refinement, like silver purified through fire. Refinement is never comfortable, but it is always purposeful. You remove what weakens us and strengthen what remains. Trust keeps us from interpreting discomfort as defeat. You are purifying our faith. You are strengthening our character. Everything is moving toward good. Lord, you also teach us that trust protects our hearts from bitterness. Ephesians 4:31 encourages us to release anger, resentment, and bitterness. When trust is absent, bitterness grows easily. When trust is present, forgiveness becomes possible. You heal wounds that resentment tries to deepen. Trust allows grace to flow where pain once lived. You soften hearts hardened by disappointment. Restoration begins where trust is chosen. You restore us gently. Father, trusting you means believing that you hear us even when answers are delayed. Psalm 65:2 declares that you hear prayer. Our prayers do not disappear into silence. They rise before you with purpose. You respond according to wisdom, not haste. Trust keeps us praying, even when results are unseen. Faith grows stronger through persistence. You honor every sincere prayer. Nothing spoken to you is wasted. Lord, you remind us that trust transforms fear into courage. Deuteronomy 31:6 tells us to be strong and courageous because you go with us. Courage is born when trust takes root. Fear loses control when your presence is acknowledged. We are not facing challenges alone. You walk beside us through every obstacle. Trust empowers boldness. Confidence replaces hesitation. We move forward, strengthened. Father, when life feels overwhelming, you remind us that you carry what we cannot. Psalm 68:19 praises you for bearing our burdens daily. You never intended for us to manage everything alone. You invite us to lean on you fully. Trust releases the weight we were never meant to carry. Relief follows surrender. Strength returns when burdens are shared. You sustain us faithfully. Lord, trusting you also brings clarity to confused hearts. Proverbs 16:3 instructs us to commit our plans to you so our thoughts may be established. Confusion fades when surrender is complete. Trust aligns our thinking with your wisdom. You bring order where chaos once lived. You guide our decisions with peace. Confidence grows as clarity settles. You lead us wisely. Father, when our faith feels small, you remind us that even mustard seed faith carries power. Matthew 17:20 teaches that faith does not need to be large to be effective. It only needs to be genuine. Trust does not depend on emotional strength. It depends on reliance. You honor sincere faith. No matter how quiet it feels, growth begins where humility exists. You strengthen faith patiently. Lord, trusting you steadies our emotions when circumstances fluctuate. Psalm 112:6-7 reminds us that the righteous will not be shaken and will not fear bad news. Stability comes from trust, not predictability. We remain anchored even when news is unsettling. Our peace does not rise and fall with circumstances. Trust creates emotional resilience. Calm replaces panic. We remain secure in you. Father, you also teach us that trust restores joy. Nehemiah 8:10 reminds us that your joy is our strength. Joy flows naturally when trust replaces fear. We do not need perfect situations to experience joy. We need confidence in you. Trust allows gratitude to rise even in difficulty. Strength returns through joy. You renew us from within. Lord, trusting you also teaches us to release control. Psalm 46:10 invites us to be still and know that you are God. Stillness requires trust. Control fades when confidence in you increases. We stop striving to manage outcomes. We rest knowing you are sovereign. Trust produces stillness. Stillness invites peace. You reign over every detail. Father, when progress feels slow, you remind us that growth is still happening. Galatians 6:9 encourages us not to grow weary in doing good because the harvest will come. Delay does not cancel reward. Persistence matters deeply to you. Trust keeps us moving even when results lag behind effort. Faithfulness is never overlooked. You honor consistency. Growth is assured. Lord, trusting you strengthens our spiritual foundation. Matthew 7:24 compares trust to building on solid rock. Storms do not determine stability. Foundation does. Those rooted in you remain standing. Trust secures us against collapse. We withstand pressure without breaking. You are our firm foundation. We remain unshaken. Father, you remind us that trust brings protection to our hearts and minds. Psalm 91:2 declares, you as our refuge and fortress. Safety flows from confidence in you. Fear diminishes where trust abides. We are covered by your care. We rest under your protection. Anxiety loosens its grip. Peace takes its place. Lord, trusting you allows us to see beyond the present moment. 2 Corinthians 4:18 reminds us to focus on what is unseen and eternal. Temporary challenges do not define permanent outcomes. Trust lifts our vision higher. Perspective changes when faith is active. We look forward with hope. You are shaping eternity through today. Everything will be fine. Father, when disappointment clouds our expectations, you renew our hope. Romans 5:3-5 teaches that endurance produces character and hope does not disappoint. Hope anchored in you never fails. Trust transforms pain into purpose. Character grows quietly through pressure. You are shaping us for greater things. Nothing is lost in your process. Lord, trusting you teaches us patience with ourselves. Psalm 103:14 reminds us that you know our frame and remember we are dust. You are gentle with our weakness. You do not rush our growth. Trust allows grace to cover imperfection. We grow step by step. You guide us patiently. You remain kind. Father, when uncertainty feels overwhelming, you remind us that you remain constant. Malachi 3:6 declares that you do not change. Circumstances shift, but you remain steady. Trust anchors us in unchanging truth. Stability comes from your nature. We rely on who you are. Fear fades in light of consistency. You remain faithful. Lord, trusting you also renews our confidence in prayer. 1 John 5:14 assures us that you hear us when we pray according to your will. Prayer strengthens trust. Trust fuels prayer. We remain connected to you. Communication deepens relationship. Confidence grows in communion. You respond faithfully. Father, you remind us that trust leads to peace-filled decisions. Isaiah 30:21 assures us that you guide us when we listen. Direction follows trust. Confusion fades with obedience. We walk forward without regret. Peace confirms our steps. You lead us clearly. Trust keeps us aligned. Lord, as trust deepens, fear loses its influence. Psalm 27:1 declares that you are our light and salvation. Darkness cannot overpower light. Fear retreats where trust remains. Confidence grows steadily. We stand secure in you. Courage rises naturally. Everything will be fine. Father, trusting you allows us to rest even before outcomes change. Hebrews 4:9-10 speaks of entering your rest through faith. Rest is an act of trust. We cease striving, we release anxiety. Peace settles deeply, confidence replaces tension. You sustain us gently. Lord, we hold firmly to the truth that you are faithful. Numbers 23:19 reminds us that you do not lie and always fulfill your word. Trust rests on your character. Promises remain secure. Hope remains alive. Faith remains strong. Everything will be fine because you never fail. Lord, trusting you also teaches our hearts to remain calm when circumstances shift suddenly and without warning. Psalm 112:8 reminds us that hearts established in trust will not be afraid even when facing adversity. Calm does not come from control but from confidence in you. When life feels unpredictable, your faithfulness remains steady and dependable. You do not waver when situations change. Trust anchors us when emotions attempt to drift. Stability grows when faith is rooted deeply in you. Father, when confusion clouds our judgment and choices feel heavy, you offer wisdom to those who trust you. James 1:5 promises that you give wisdom generously to those who ask without finding fault. You do not withhold clarity from sincere hearts. You guide gently rather than forcefully. Trust opens our ears to your direction. Peace confirms the path you illuminate. You never lead us into confusion. Lord, trusting you reshapes how we interpret delays in our lives. Ecclesiastes 3:11 declares that you make everything beautiful in its time. What feels late to us is never late to you. Delay is often preparation disguised as waiting. You are aligning circumstances beyond what we can perceive. Trust allows patience to replace frustration. Beauty emerges in your timing. Everything unfolds with purpose. Father, when progress feels invisible, you remind us that growth often happens beneath the surface. Mark 4:26-27 illustrates that seeds grow even while we sleep. We may not see daily change, but transformation is underway. Trust keeps us faithful during quiet seasons. Consistency matters even when applause is absent. You honor perseverance. Growth is guaranteed under your care. Lord, trusting you also protects us from despair when answers feel distant. Psalm 42:11 encourages us to put our hope in you even when our souls feel downcast. Hope is sustained by trust rather than circumstance. You lift our perspective when discouragement presses in. You remind us that this moment is not the conclusion. Trust renews expectation. Light returns gradually but surely. Father, when fear tries to dominate our thoughts at night, you provide peace that guards our minds. Psalm 4:8 assures us that you grant peaceful rest to those who trust you. Sleep becomes possible when trust replaces worry. You quiet anxious thoughts gently. Rest restores strength we did not know we needed. Trust allows our bodies to relax. Peace settles deeply within. Lord, trusting you also frees us from comparison with others. Galatians 6:4 reminds us to focus on our own journey rather than measuring ourselves against others. Each path unfolds differently under your guidance. Comparison weakens trust. Contentment grows when we trust your timing for our lives. You tailor growth individually. You know exactly what we need. Our journey is secure in you. Father, when disappointment from past experiences tries to limit our expectations, you renew our outlook. Isaiah 43:18-19 invites us not to dwell on former things because you are doing something new. Trust opens us to fresh beginnings. The past does not define what you are building now. You create pathways where none existed before. Hope rises as trust deepens. New possibilities emerge under your hand. Lord, trusting you strengthens us to face uncertainty with courage rather than avoidance. Joshua 1:7 reminds us to be strong and courageous by staying aligned with your word. Courage flows from confidence in your presence. Fear diminishes when trust is active. We step forward without paralysis. You equip us for challenges ahead. Boldness grows quietly within us. Father, you remind us that trust transforms worry into prayer. 1 Peter 5:7 encourages us to cast all our anxieties on you because you care for us. Worry loses power when surrendered. Prayer becomes a place of exchange. We release fear and receive peace. Trust fuels communication with you. Burdens lighten immediately. Care flows from you to us. Lord, trusting you also realigns our priorities when stress pulls us in many directions. Matthew 6:33 teaches us to seek first your kingdom and righteousness. Trust simplifies life. Focus replaces distraction. Peace follows alignment. You supply what we truly need. Anxiety fades when priorities are clear. You remain our source. Father, when exhaustion sets in from prolonged pressure, you restore strength to those who trust you. Isaiah 40:29 promises strength to the weary. You replenish what life drains. Rest returns as trust deepens. Energy renews gradually. You sustain us patiently. Weariness does not defeat us. You lift us again. Lord, trusting you also strengthens us during seasons of emotional vulnerability. Psalm 73:26 reminds us that even when our flesh and heart fail, you remain the strength of our heart. Weakness does not disqualify us from your care. You draw closer when strength feels limited. Trust allows us to lean without shame. You carry us gently. Strength is renewed through dependence. Father, when hope feels delayed, you remind us that your timing is always intentional. Romans 8:18 reassures us that present suffering cannot compare to the glory you are preparing. Trust lifts our eyes beyond immediate discomfort. Perspective widens through faith. You are preparing something greater than what we can see now. Waiting refines our expectation. Hope matures quietly. Lord, trusting you guards our hearts from discouragement when progress seems slow. Zechariah 4:10 reminds us not to despise small beginnings. Growth often begins quietly. Trust allows us to celebrate small steps forward. Consistency matters more than speed. You honor faithfulness over visibility. Progress continues even when unnoticed. You are attentive to every step. Father, trusting you also teaches us to release what no longer aligns with your will. Isaiah 55:8-9 reminds us that your thoughts and ways are higher than ours. Letting go can feel uncomfortable, yet trust reassures us that release creates room for renewal. You remove what limits growth. You replace loss with purpose. Obedience brings peace. Alignment restores confidence. Lord, trusting you restores emotional balance during seasons of tension. Psalm 29:11 declares that you bless your people with peace. Peace does not mean the absence of pressure. It means strength within pressure. Trust allows peace to coexist with challenge. Calm steadies our emotions. We remain centered. You uphold us securely. Father, when fear of failure surfaces, you remind us that our worth is not measured by outcomes. Psalm 27:1 teaches that unless you build the house, labor is in vain. Trust shifts focus from performance to obedience. We release pressure to prove ourselves. You value faithfulness more than perfection. Identity remains secure in you. Confidence grows gently. Lord, trusting you encourages resilience when setbacks arise. Proverbs 24:16 reminds us that though the righteous fall, they rise again. Failure is not final under your care. Trust prevents shame from taking root. Grace lifts us forward. Learning replaces regret. Growth continues. You restore momentum. Father, trusting you also strengthens our relationships by cultivating patience and understanding. Ephesians 4:2 calls us to humility, gentleness, and patience with one another. Trust reduces defensiveness. Compassion grows when trust is present. We respond thoughtfully rather than react emotionally. Healing flows more freely. Peace shapes interactions. Love matures through trust. Lord, trusting you brings clarity during moments of internal conflict. Psalm 25:4-5 asks you to show us your ways and teach us your paths. Direction becomes clearer when trust leads. Confusion fades gradually. You illuminate the next step. We follow without fear. Wisdom replaces uncertainty. You guide consistently. Father, trusting you also protects our hearts from resentment. Hebrews 12:15 warns against bitterness taking root. Trust allows forgiveness to flow. Healing replaces hostility. Peace enters wounded places. You cleanse hearts gently. Restoration becomes possible. Freedom follows forgiveness. Lord, trusting you invites rest into places once filled with striving. Exodus 33:14 promises that your presence brings rest. Rest is not inactivity. It is confidence in your sufficiency. Trust silences the need to control. Calm returns naturally. We breathe freely again. You sustain us. Father, trusting you helps us interpret challenges as opportunities for growth. 1 Peter 1:6-7 reminds us that trials refine faith like gold. Refinement is valuable. Trust keeps us from resisting growth. Strength develops quietly. Faith becomes resilient. Purpose unfolds. You work skillfully. Lord, trusting you strengthens us to stand firm under pressure. Ephesians 6:13 encourages us to stand when challenges arise. Trust keeps us grounded. We do not collapse under stress. Courage remains steady. Endurance builds character. You equip us fully. Victory begins with trust. Father, trusting you also renews our vision when disappointment clouds hope. Psalm 33:11 assures us that your plans endure forever. Trust lifts our focus beyond temporary setbacks. Hope regains strength. Perspective widens. Confidence returns. You are working toward good. Assurance settles in. Lord, trusting you calms fears related to provision and security. Matthew 6:26 reminds us that you care for us more than the birds of the air. Provision flows from your care. Worry loosens its grip. Trust reassures our hearts. Needs are met faithfully. You remain our provider. Father, trusting you cultivates gratitude even during uncertainty. 1 Thessalonians 5:18 encourages thanksgiving in all circumstances. Gratitude grows where trust lives. Appreciation replaces anxiety. Joy emerges quietly. Hearts soften. Peace expands. You fill us completely. Lord, trusting you also restores confidence when self-doubt arises. Psalm 38:8 reminds us that you will fulfill your purpose for us. Doubt fades under assurance. Trust reinforces identity. Confidence builds gradually. Purpose becomes clear. You complete what you begin. We remain secure. Father, trusting you steadies us during seasons of waiting. Psalm 27:14 encourages waiting with courage. Waiting strengthens character. Trust sustains hope. Patience matures faith. Strength grows quietly. Anticipation remains alive. You never disappoint. Lord, trusting you allows us to face uncertainty without fear of loss. Romans 8:38-39 reminds us that nothing can separate us from your love. Security rests in relationship. Fear loses authority. Confidence remains strong. Trust anchors our hearts. Everything will be fine. Father, trusting you brings peace that surpasses understanding. Philippians 4:7 assures us of this peace guarding our hearts and minds. Peace stands watch over our thoughts. Anxiety fades gradually. Calm becomes natural. Trust deepens daily. You remain faithful. Lord, we hold to the truth that trusting you leads us safely forward. Psalm 37:5 encourages committing our way to you and trusting you to act. We release outcomes into your hands. Confidence replaces fear. Direction remains steady. Hope stands firm. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you trains our hearts to remain anchored when emotions rise and fall without warning. Psalm 16:8 reminds us that when we keep you before us, we will not be shaken. Emotional waves do not determine spiritual stability. Trust establishes a steady center within us. We learn to observe emotions without being ruled by them. You teach us calm endurance. Peace becomes our internal posture. Father, when our confidence is tested by repeated challenges, you remind us that faith grows through persistence. Luke 18:1 teaches us to pray and not lose heart. Persistence is not pressure, but devotion. Trust keeps us returning to you even when answers take time. Each prayer strengthens resilience. Hope deepens through consistency. You honor perseverance faithfully. Lord, trusting you also reframes how we experience loss. Joel 2:25 speaks of restoration for years that were lost or eaten away. Loss does not define the end of our story. Trust allows restoration to begin where loss once lived. You redeem time with precision and grace. Healing unfolds in unexpected ways. What was lost is not forgotten. Renewal is assured. Father, when insecurity surfaces and self-doubt tries to speak loudly, you remind us who we are in you. Isaiah 43:1 declares that you have called us by name and we belong to you. Identity rooted in you remains unshaken. Trust silences voices that question our worth. Confidence grows through belonging. We stand firm in truth. You claim us lovingly. Lord, trusting you also guards our minds against fear-based assumptions. Proverbs 18:10 reminds us that your name is a strong tower where the righteous find safety. Safety is found in truth rather than speculation. Trust prevents our thoughts from spiraling into worst-case scenarios. You invite us to take refuge in you. Calm replaces panic. Security settles in our thinking. Father, when progress feels inconsistent, you remind us that growth is rarely linear. Philippians 1:6 assures us that you will complete the work you began. Trust allows patience with the process. We do not measure growth only by visible milestones. You are shaping depth, not just speed. Faith matures quietly. Completion is guaranteed. Lord, trusting you restores emotional strength when discouragement feels persistent. Psalm 34:17 tells us that you hear the cries of the righteous and deliver them. Deliverance may not be immediate, but it is certain. Trust keeps our hearts open rather than hardened. Hope survives difficulty. You respond with compassion. Relief comes in your time. Father, trusting you also teaches us to rest in seasons of uncertainty. Hebrews 4:11 encourages us to enter your rest through faith. Rest is not passive surrender, but active trust. We release urgency. We relinquish control. Calm grows where trust exists. You restore us deeply. Strength returns gently. Lord, trusting you sharpens discernment when choices feel overwhelming. Psalm 119:105 declares that your word is a lamp to our feet. Light does not reveal the entire path, only the next step. Trust teaches us to move step by step. We do not rush ahead blindly. Peace confirms direction. You guide wisely. Father, trusting you strengthens our ability to forgive when wounds linger. Matthew 18:21-22 reminds us that forgiveness flows from grace rather than limitation. Trust allows healing to replace resentment. Bitterness loses power. Freedom enters wounded places. Love softens hardened edges. Restoration becomes possible. You heal relationships patiently. Lord, trusting you also renews courage when fear of failure arises. Psalm 27:14 encourages us to wait on you and be strong. Strength is sustained through patience. Courage grows through trust. We face challenges without retreat. You remain our source of boldness. Confidence stabilizes our steps. Father, when disappointment clouds our expectations, you redirect our hope. Romans 12:12 encourages rejoicing in hope and perseverance in prayer. Hope rooted in you remains alive. Trust prevents despair from settling. Faith keeps our vision lifted. You renew expectation gently. Joy becomes resilient. Lord, trusting you also stabilizes our responses under pressure. Proverbs 15:1 reminds us that gentle responses turn away anger. Trust calms impulsive reactions. Wisdom governs our words. Peace guides our tone. Relationships benefit from restraint. You shape our character. Maturity develops steadily. Father, trusting you allows us to release fear about provision. Psalm 23:1 declares that you are our shepherd and we lack nothing. Provision flows from relationship. Trust quiets anxiety about needs. You supply faithfully. Confidence replaces worry. Gratitude rises naturally. You remain our source. Lord, trusting you restores motivation when weariness threatens momentum. Galatians 6:9 encourages us not to grow weary in doing good. Weariness does not cancel purpose. Trust fuels perseverance. Energy returns gradually. Strength renews through faith. You honor faithfulness. Reward follows obedience. Father, trusting you also nurtures patience with ourselves during growth. Psalm 103:13-14 reminds us that you are compassionate and know our limitations. Trust allows grace toward imperfection. Progress continues without condemnation. You are patient with us. We learn gently. Growth feels safe. You remain kind. Lord, trusting you also steadies us during moments of isolation. Psalm 68:6 declares that you place the lonely in families. Trust assures connection even when alone. Presence replaces emptiness. Comfort flows quietly. You draw us closer. Belonging becomes real. You surround us. Father, trusting you redefines success beyond outward outcomes. Micah 6:8 reminds us that you value justice, mercy, and humility. Success becomes obedience rather than recognition. Trust shifts our priorities. Purpose feels aligned. Contentment grows. Peace accompanies faithfulness. You affirm our steps. Lord, trusting you protects us from rushing ahead of your timing. Psalm 27:14 reminds us again to wait with courage. Waiting strengthens discipline. Trust resists impulsive decisions. Wisdom prevails over haste. You refine patience. Direction becomes clearer. Timing aligns perfectly. Father, trusting you also renews spiritual hunger when passion feels low. Psalm 42:1 compares longing for you to thirst. Trust reawakens desire. Connection deepens gradually. Prayer becomes sincere again. Worship feels authentic. You draw us closer. Intimacy grows. Lord, trusting you builds resilience against discouraging voices. Romans 8:1 declares no condemnation for those in you. Accusation loses influence. Trust affirms grace. Confidence replaces shame. Freedom settles deeply. Identity remains secure. You restore dignity. Father, trusting you steadies us through transitions we did not anticipate. Isaiah 30:21 assures us that you guide us clearly. Direction emerges gradually. Trust calms uncertainty. Movement becomes confident. Fear diminishes. You lead faithfully. Assurance follows obedience. Lord, trusting you cultivates inner peace, regardless of outward noise. John 14:27 promises peace, not as the world gives. Peace becomes internal and lasting. Trust guards our hearts. Anxiety fades quietly. Calm becomes natural. You remain near. Everything will be fine. Father, trusting you confirms that our future is secure in your care. Psalm 1:178 reminds us that you watch over our coming and going. Security flows from your protection. Trust steadies anticipation. Confidence remains strong. Hope stands firm. You guard every step. Lord, trusting you allows us to rest even before circumstances change. Romans 8:24-25 reminds us that hope waits patiently. Waiting does not weaken faith. Trust sustains expectation. Peace fills the present moment. Assurance remains constant. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you teaches our hearts to remain steady when answers do not arrive as quickly as we desire. Psalm 27:13 reminds us that we will see your goodness in the land of the living, even when waiting stretches our patience. Waiting does not weaken faith when trust is present. It strengthens endurance and deepens dependence on you. You are never idle during delays. You are preparing outcomes beyond our sight. Confidence grows as trust matures. Father, when uncertainty presses against our thoughts, you invite us to remember your past faithfulness. Psalm 77:11 encourages us to recall the works you have done before. Memory becomes a source of strength. Trust is renewed when we remember how you carried us previously. What you have done before, you can do again. History becomes testimony. Hope rises naturally. Lord, trusting you also reshapes how we view unanswered questions. Deuteronomy 29 reminds us that some things belong to you alone. Not knowing everything does not weaken trust. It strengthens humility. You reveal what we need at the right time. Trust accepts mystery without fear. Peace coexists with unanswered questions. You remain trustworthy. Father, when emotional fatigue sets in, you offer renewal to those who rely on you. Isaiah 40:31 assures us that those who hope in you will renew their strength. Renewal does not always come suddenly. It unfolds gradually through rest and reliance. Trust allows restoration to begin quietly. Strength returns gently. You lift us patiently. Lord, trusting you steadies our hearts when fear tries to exaggerate outcomes. Psalm 56:3 reminds us that when we are afraid, we can trust in you. Fear loses authority when trust is chosen. We refuse to let imagination overpower truth. Calm returns as trust settles in. You regulate our thoughts. Peace replaces panic. Father, trusting you also teaches us to value obedience over immediate results. 1 Samuel 15:22 reminds us that obedience matters deeply to you. Trust honors obedience even when outcomes are delayed. Faithfulness remains valuable regardless of recognition. You see every obedient step. Reward follows faithfulness. You never overlook commitment. Lord, trusting you protects our hearts from discouragement caused by comparison. 2 Corinthians 10:12 reminds us that comparison lacks wisdom. Each journey unfolds uniquely under your guidance. Trust affirms our individual path. Contentment grows when comparison fades. Peace replaces envy. You lead each heart personally. Father, when life feels unpredictable, you remind us that your character remains constant. Hebrews 13:8 declares that you remain the same forever. Stability flows from who you are. Trust anchors us in unchanging truth. Circumstances shift, but you do not. Confidence grows through consistency. You remain faithful. Lord, trusting you strengthens us to face challenges with perseverance rather than retreat. James 1:12 reminds us that perseverance leads to blessing. Endurance is cultivated through trust. We remain committed despite pressure. Strength develops quietly. You honor perseverance. Victory follows endurance. Father, trusting you also renews our perspective when obstacles appear overwhelming. Matthew 19:26 reminds us that with you, all things are possible. Limitations dissolve under faith. Trust expands our vision. Hope replaces doubt. Possibility emerges where fear lived. You redefine what is achievable. Lord, trusting you guards our hearts against resentment during difficult interactions. Romans 12:19 reminds us to leave justice in your hands. Trust releases the need for control. Peace replaces anger. Healing begins where surrender exists. You handle what we cannot. Freedom follows release. Father, trusting you also strengthens discernment during seasons of decision-making. Proverbs 3:5-6 reminds us to trust you fully so you can direct our paths. Direction flows from surrender. Clarity follows trust. We move without confusion. Peace confirms choices. You guide faithfully. Lord, trusting you stabilizes our emotions when expectations are unmet. Psalm 37:7 encourages us to be still and wait patiently. Stillness calms disappointment. Trust softens frustration. Hope remains alive. You work beneath the surface. Outcomes align eventually. Father, trusting you renews inner confidence when setbacks challenge momentum. Micah 7:7 reminds us to look to you for salvation. Confidence grows through reliance. Failure does not define identity. Trust restores forward movement. Strength returns gradually. You lift us again, Lord. Trusting you also teaches us gratitude during incomplete seasons. Habakkuk 3:17-18 reminds us to rejoice even when circumstances lack abundance. Gratitude grows where trust lives. Joy is not postponed. Faith remains active. Contentment replaces anxiety. You sustain us, Father. Trusting you allows healing to continue even when pain lingers. Psalm 34:18 assures us that you are close to the brokenhearted. Closeness brings comfort. Trust allows healing without pressure. Restoration unfolds naturally. You remain gentle. Strength grows quietly. Lord, trusting you stabilizes us when future plans feel uncertain. Jeremiah 10:23 reminds us that our steps are directed by you. Direction remains secure under trust. Fear of missteps diminishes. Confidence grows steadily. You lead deliberately. Assurance settles deeply. Father, trusting you also renews our hope when outcomes feel delayed. Romans 8:25 reminds us that hope waits patiently. Waiting strengthens character. Trust sustains expectation. Faith remains alive. Peace fills the present. You remain faithful. Lord, trusting you helps us release fear about provision. Matthew 6:31-33 reassures us of your care. Needs are known to you. Trust calms financial anxiety. Provision follows alignment. Gratitude replaces worry. You provide faithfully. Father, trusting you cultivates resilience in seasons of transition. Psalm 66:9 reminds us that you preserve our lives. Preservation flows from trust. Stability remains during change. Confidence strengthens. You uphold us securely. Nothing is lost. Lord, trusting you also renews spiritual clarity when confusion arises. John 8:12 reminds us that you are the light of the world. Light dispels confusion. Trust aligns vision. Direction becomes visible. Fear diminishes. You illuminate the way. Father, trusting you strengthens patience with people and processes. Colossians 3:12 calls us to patience and kindness. Trust softens reactions. Compassion increases. Peace governs responses. Relationships benefit. Growth matures. Lord, trusting you protects our hearts from hopelessness. Lamentations 3:22-23 reminds us that your mercies are new every morning. Hope renews daily. Trust resets perspective. Faith remains steady. Strength is replenished. You remain near. Father, trusting you confirms that nothing we face is beyond your care. Psalm 55:22 invites us to cast burdens on you. Release brings relief. Trust lightens the load. Peace settles deeply. Confidence grows. You sustain us fully. Lord, trusting you allows us to rest before outcomes are visible. Hebrews 11:1 defines faith as assurance of things hoped for. Assurance replaces anxiety. Trust stabilizes the heart. Peace governs the mind. Hope remains alive. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you reshapes how we breathe through moments when pressure feels constant and unrelenting. Psalm 61:2 reminds us that when our hearts feel overwhelmed, you lead us to a higher place. Overwhelmed does not mean defeat when trust is present. You lift our perspective above the noise. You steady our breathing and calm our thoughts. Trust anchors us when pressure intensifies. Peace rises as we look to you. Father, when discouragement quietly whispers that our efforts are unnoticed, you remind us that you see every faithful step. Hebrews 6:10 assures us that you do not forget the work and love shown in your name. Trust keeps us faithful even without immediate affirmation. You honor obedience done in secret. Quiet faith carries great weight in your kingdom. Our labor is never invisible to you. Confidence grows knowing you see us. Lord, trusting you also teaches our hearts to remain hopeful when outcomes are uncertain. Romans 15:4 reminds us that Scripture was written to give endurance and hope. Hope is sustained through truth rather than circumstance. Trust feeds hope daily. We remain expectant without anxiety. You shape patience through waiting. Hope becomes resilient in you. Father, when our emotions fluctuate unexpectedly, you provide stability that does not depend on feelings. Psalm 112:7 reminds us that hearts established in trust will not fear bad news. Emotional swings lose authority under trust. We learn to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. Calm replaces inner turbulence. Peace governs our responses. You stabilize us from within. Lord, trusting you strengthens our inner resolve during seasons of prolonged challenge. 2 Corinthians 4:16 reminds us that though outwardly we may feel weary, inwardly we are being renewed. Renewal happens quietly through trust. You restore strength beyond what is visible. Endurance builds steadily. Faith matures in pressure. You sustain us patiently. Father, trusting you teaches us to release resentment when life feels unfair. Ephesians 4:32 encourages kindness and forgiveness rooted in grace. Trust softens hearts hardened by disappointment. Forgiveness becomes possible when trust replaces control. You heal wounds bitterness would deepen. Peace enters where resentment once lived. Restoration follows surrender. Lord, trusting you allows us to face the unknown without paralysis. Isaiah 43:2 assures us that when we pass through waters, you are with us. The unknown loses power when your presence is acknowledged. Fear retreats where trust remains active. Courage grows quietly. We move forward without dread. You remain beside us. Father, when exhaustion tries to drain our motivation, you replenish strength through trust. Psalm 73:26 reminds us that you are the strength of our heart forever. Strength does not rely solely on physical energy. You renew us emotionally and spiritually. Trust allows restoration to flow naturally. Energy returns gently. You sustain us fully. Lord, trusting you also sharpens discernment when voices around us compete for attention. John 10:27 reminds us that your sheep hear your voice. Trust tunes our hearts to truth. Distractions lose influence. Clarity emerges gradually. We recognize your guidance. Peace confirms direction. You lead us clearly. Father, trusting you transforms anxiety into confident expectation. Philippians 4:6-7 teaches us to exchange worry for prayer. Trust creates that exchange naturally. Anxiety loosens its grip. Peace takes its place. Our minds remain guarded. Hearts grow calm. You reign over our thoughts. Lord, trusting you also nurtures patience when progress feels slow. James 5:7 reminds us to wait patiently like a farmer awaiting harvest. Growth takes time. Trust respects process. We do not rush outcomes. Faithfulness continues quietly. Results come in season. You remain faithful, Father. Trusting you steadies us during emotional vulnerability. Psalm 34:18 assures us that you are close to the brokenhearted. Nearness brings comfort. Trust allows us to be honest without fear. Healing unfolds gently. Strength returns gradually. You remain compassionate. Lord, trusting you guards our identity during moments of doubt. Isaiah 41:9 reminds us that you have chosen us and not rejected us. Doubt loses power when truth is remembered. Trust anchors identity in you. Confidence returns quietly. Belonging feels secure. You affirm us continually. Father, trusting you also protects our hearts from fear-based decisions. Proverbs 14:12 warns that paths driven by fear lead astray. Trust aligns us with wisdom. Discernment replaces impulse. Peace guides choices. Outcomes remain secure. You direct us faithfully. Lord, trusting you restores joy when heaviness tries to linger. Psalm 35 reminds us that joy comes in the morning. Night seasons do not last forever. Trust keeps hope alive. Joy rises gradually. Light returns quietly. You restore us fully. Father, trusting you teaches us to remain gentle with ourselves during growth. Psalm 103:14 reminds us that you understand our limits. Trust allows grace for imperfection. Progress continues without condemnation. Compassion replaces self-criticism. Growth feels safe. You remain patient. Lord, trusting you also brings courage to face conversations we have avoided. Matthew 5:9 encourages peacemaking. Trust strengthens honesty. Wisdom shapes words. Fear of confrontation fades. Healing becomes possible. Peace follows obedience. You guide interactions. Father, trusting you stabilizes us when plans change unexpectedly. Proverbs 20:24 reminds us that our steps are directed by you. Direction remains intact despite change. Trust calms uncertainty. Confidence holds steady. You guide transitions. Assurance grows. Lord, trusting you renews hope during seasons of waiting. Psalm 135 speaks of waiting with expectation. Expectation replaces despair. Trust sustains patience. Faith remains alive. Peace fills the present moment. You remain trustworthy. Father, trusting you also calms fear related to provision. Psalm 37:25 reminds us that you do not abandon the righteous. Provision follows faithfulness. Anxiety fades where trust lives. Gratitude grows naturally. Confidence increases. You provide consistently. Lord, trusting you builds resilience against discouragement. 2 Thessalonians 3:3 reminds us that you strengthen and protect us. Protection flows from trust. Courage remains steady. Fear loses control. Confidence grows quietly. You uphold us. Father, trusting you allows rest even before answers arrive. Exodus 14:14 reminds us that you fight for us while we remain still. Stillness reflects trust. Anxiety loosens. Peace settles deeply. Confidence replaces striving. You work on our behalf. Lord, trusting you reminds us that no season is wasted. Romans 8:18 assures us that future glory outweighs present struggle. Perspective shifts through trust. Endurance gains meaning. Hope strengthens. Faith matures. You redeem every season. Father, trusting you anchors our hearts in truth rather than fear. Psalm 119:65 promises great peace to those who trust your word. Peace becomes stable. Anxiety loses influence. Confidence grows. Assurance remains firm. You are faithful. Lord, trusting you allows us to rest securely in the present. Isaiah 12:2 declares that you are our salvation and strength. Confidence replaces fear. Peace governs our hearts. Trust sustains us. Hope remains steady. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you teaches us how to remain grounded when life feels noisy and overwhelming from every direction. Psalm 46:10 gently calls us to be still and know that you are God. Stillness does not mean inactivity but deep confidence in your control. Trust allows us to pause instead of panic. Our hearts slow down as we remember who governs all things. Peace grows when we stop striving. You reign above every storm. Father, when uncertainty tries to pull our focus into fear, you redirect our attention to your promises. Numbers 23:19 reminds us that you do not lie, and you always fulfill what you have spoken. Trust is built on your character, not on circumstances. What you promised will come to pass. Doubt loses its voice when truth is remembered. Our confidence becomes steady again. You remain faithful in every word. Lord, trusting you strengthens our hearts during moments when answers feel delayed, but hope must remain alive. Psalm 33:20 reminds us that our hope is in you, our help and shield. Waiting does not weaken trust when hope is anchored correctly. You shield us emotionally while we wait. You protect our faith from discouragement. Trust keeps us standing. Hope remains firm. Father, when fear attempts to magnify problems beyond reality, you remind us of your power and authority. Jeremiah 32:17 declares that nothing is too difficult for you. What feels impossible to us is not impossible to you. Trust expands our perspective beyond limitation. Anxiety shrinks in the presence of faith. Confidence grows where trust is practiced. You remain sovereign. Lord, trusting you also teaches us to walk by faith rather than sight. 2 Corinthians 5:7 reminds us that faith does not require visible proof. Trust becomes our vision when sight feels unclear. We move forward without needing every detail. Peace confirms our steps. Fear fades gradually. You guide us faithfully. Father, when discouragement tries to settle in our thoughts, you lift our eyes toward hope. Psalm 121:1-2 reminds us that our help comes from you, the maker of heaven and earth. Help is never far away. Trust reminds us we are supported. We are not carrying life alone. Strength rises from dependence. You uphold us. Lord, trusting you restores emotional balance when disappointment threatens joy. Proverbs 13:12 tells us that hope deferred can make the heart sick, but fulfillment brings life. Trust keeps hope alive during delay. We do not abandon expectation. You are preparing fulfillment carefully. Healing unfolds through patience. Joy will return. Father, trusting you also deepens our spiritual maturity through endurance. Hebrews 6:12 encourages us to imitate those who inherit promises through faith and patience. Endurance shapes character quietly. Trust keeps us faithful through long seasons. Growth continues even without recognition. You honor patience deeply. Promise fulfillment remains sure. Lord, trusting you teaches us to respond with grace rather than react in fear. Colossians 4:6 encourages our words to be seasoned with grace. Trust steadies our speech. Wisdom shapes our responses. Peace governs our tone. Relationships benefit from restraint. You shape our character through trust. Father, when the weight of responsibility feels heavy, you invite us to lean fully on you. Psalm 55:22 reminds us to cast our burdens on you because you sustain us. Sustaining strength flows from surrender. Trust lightens emotional load. Pressure eases gradually. Rest becomes accessible. You support us completely. Lord, trusting you also renews confidence when we feel unsure of our next step. Psalm 32:8 promises guidance with your loving eye. Direction does not disappear in uncertainty. Trust keeps us attentive. Peace confirms movement. Clarity emerges in time. You lead gently. Father, trusting you allows us to release fear surrounding outcomes we cannot control. Ecclesiastes 11:5 reminds us that we do not know all the work you are doing. Not knowing does not threaten faith. Trust embraces mystery without anxiety. Peace coexists with uncertainty. Confidence remains steady. You are working beyond our understanding. Lord, trusting you restores inner calm when our environment feels unstable. John 14:1 encourages us not to let our hearts be troubled. Trust settles restless thoughts. Fear loosens its grip. Calm fills our inner space. Security grows inwardly. You remain near. Father, trusting you builds resilience when life feels repetitive or stagnant. Galatians 6:9 reminds us that we will reap if we do not give up. Trust fuels perseverance. Routine becomes preparation. Faithfulness continues quietly. Growth unfolds beneath the surface. You reward endurance. Lord, trusting you also nurtures gratitude, even when progress feels slow. Psalm 103:2 reminds us not to forget your benefits. Gratitude strengthens trust. Appreciation replaces frustration. Perspective shifts gently. Joy becomes accessible again. You fill our hearts. Father, trusting you helps us release fear about the opinions of others. Proverbs 29:25 warns that fear of people brings a snare. Trust frees us from approval seeking. Identity remains secure in you. Confidence grows internally. Peace replaces anxiety. You affirm us, Lord. Trusting you strengthens our hearts against discouraging thoughts. Isaiah 35:4 encourages us to strengthen weak hands and feeble knees. Trust restores courage. Hope lifts posture. Faith renews motivation. We stand taller inwardly. You empower us. Father, trusting you allows emotional healing to continue without force or pressure. Psalm 147:3 reminds us that you heal the brokenhearted. Healing flows gently through trust. Pain softens gradually. Restoration unfolds naturally. Strength returns quietly. You are compassionate. Lord, trusting you also steadies us when future plans feel uncertain. Jeremiah 10:23 reminds us that our steps are directed by you. Direction does not depend on our clarity. Trust assures guidance. Fear of missteps diminishes. Confidence builds slowly. You lead faithfully. Father, trusting you renews our sense of purpose during confusing seasons. Proverbs 16:4 reminds us that you work everything for purpose. Nothing is wasted. Trust reframes struggle. Meaning emerges through patience. Hope strengthens quietly. You remain intentional. Lord, trusting you guards our peace when the world feels chaotic. Psalm 91:1 speaks of resting under your protection. Safety flows from closeness. Trust shelters our hearts. Anxiety weakens. Calm prevails. You are our refuge. Father, trusting you also renews our strength during emotional exhaustion. Matthew 11:28 invites us to come to you for rest. Rest restores perspective. Trust quiets striving. Energy renews gradually. Peace settles deeply. You refresh us. Lord, trusting you reassures us that nothing can separate us from your care. Romans 8:35 reminds us of your unwavering love. Love anchors trust. Fear dissolves. Confidence remains firm. Security deepens. You remain constant. Father, trusting you allows us to remain hopeful even before outcomes appear. Hebrews 10:23 encourages holding firmly to hope. Hope strengthens faith. Trust sustains endurance. Peace fills waiting moments. Assurance remains alive. You are faithful. Lord, trusting you settles our hearts into confident rest. Isaiah 26:12 reminds us that you establish peace for us. Peace becomes natural. Anxiety fades away. Trust deepens steadily. Confidence remains strong. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you teaches us how to remain steady when life asks us to carry responsibilities that feel heavier than expected. Psalm 68:19 reminds us that you daily bear our burdens, even the ones we do not know how to explain. Burdens feel lighter when trust replaces self-reliance. You never intended for us to manage everything alone. Trust invites divine assistance into human limitation. Strength flows when surrender becomes natural. You carry what we cannot. Father, when our hearts feel conflicted and decisions feel weighty, you invite us to lean on your wisdom rather than our own understanding. Proverbs 2:6 reminds us that you give wisdom and knowledge freely. Trust opens our hearts to receive guidance. Confusion fades as wisdom settles in. You clarify what once felt tangled. Peace confirms wise direction. You lead us gently. Lord, trusting you restores stability when emotional fatigue threatens joy. Nehemiah 8:10 reminds us that your joy is our strength. Joy does not disappear because life becomes difficult. Trust allows joy to remain present, even during struggle. Strength rises where joy is protected. Faith nourishes inner resilience. You renew us from within. Father, when expectations do not unfold as planned, you remind us that disappointment does not cancel purpose. Romans 8:28 assures us again that you work all things together for good. Trust reframes disappointment in development. Growth continues even when outcomes differ. You transform frustration into wisdom. Hope regains clarity. You remain intentional. Lord, trusting you also teaches patience when growth feels slow. Psalm 41 speaks of waiting patiently for you. Patience deepens trust rather than weakening it. Waiting refines character. Faith matures quietly. Expectation remains alive. You honor those who wait. Father, when fear attempts to dominate our thoughts, you replace it with assurance. Isaiah 41:13 reminds us that you hold our hand and help us. Presence defeats fear. Trust makes nearness tangible. Calm replaces panic. Courage grows gently. You remain close. Lord, trusting you steadies our hearts when life feels uncertain and unpredictable. Psalm 112:6 reminds us that the righteous will not be shaken. Stability comes from trust, not circumstances. We remain grounded when faith is firm. Anxiety loses influence. Peace settles deeply. You sustain us. Father, trusting you allows us to release control over outcomes beyond our reach. Ecclesiastes 7:14 reminds us that you allow both prosperity and adversity. Control fades when trust increases. Acceptance brings peace. Wisdom replaces resistance. We grow through surrender. You remain sovereign. Lord, trusting you nurtures courage when facing unfamiliar territory. Joshua 1:9 reminds us again to be strong and courageous because you are with us. Courage is strengthened through trust. Fear retreats gradually. Confidence grows steadily. We move forward obediently. You go before us. Father, when loneliness tries to convince us we are unseen, you reassure us of your constant presence. Psalm 139:7-10 reminds us that we cannot escape your presence. Trust dissolves isolation. Comfort replaces emptiness. Assurance settles quietly. We are never abandoned. You surround us. Lord, trusting you also reshapes how we respond to criticism and misunderstanding. Proverbs 12:16 teaches wisdom through restraint. Trust allows us to remain calm. Defensive reactions lose power. Peace governs our responses. Confidence remains intact. You protect our dignity. Father, trusting you restores hope when prayers seem unanswered. Psalm 13:5 reminds us to trust in your unfailing love. Love remains active even when silence lingers. Trust keeps faith alive. Expectation persists. Hope strengthens gradually. You hear every prayer. Lord, trusting you stabilizes our hearts during seasons of transition. Isaiah 43:18-19 reminds us that you are doing something new. New seasons require trust. Familiar ground shifts. Fear fades as faith grows. Anticipation replaces anxiety. You lead us forward. Father, trusting you also renews emotional strength after prolonged stress. Matthew 11:29 invites us to learn from you, because you are gentle. Gentleness restores weary hearts. Trust allows rest without guilt. Healing unfolds gradually. Strength returns quietly. You remain compassionate. Lord, trusting you guards our hearts from despair when outcomes feel delayed. Lamentations 3:31 assures us that you do not reject forever. Delay is not denial. Trust sustains hope. Mercy remains active. Restoration approaches. You remain faithful. Father, trusting you teaches us gratitude, even when blessings appear small. Psalm 103:2 reminds us not to forget your benefits. Gratitude deepens trust. Perspective widens. Contentment grows. Joy becomes accessible. You fill our hearts. Lord, trusting you strengthens patience in relationships that require grace. Colossians 3:13 encourages forgiveness. Trust softens our responses. Compassion replaces frustration. Healing flows slowly. Peace governs interactions. You shape our hearts. Father, trusting you renews clarity when confusion clouds our thoughts. John 14:26 reminds us that your Spirit teaches us. Teaching unfolds through trust. Understanding grows gradually. Fear subsides. Direction becomes clear. You guide us. Lord, trusting you also protects our peace when news or circumstances feel unsettling. Psalm 91:5 assures us that we need not fear. Fear loses influence under trust. Calm steadies our reactions. Confidence remains strong. Peace prevails. You guard us. Father, trusting you renews strength when discouragement threatens endurance. Isaiah 35:3-4 encourages strengthening weak hands. Trust restores courage. Hope lifts vision. Faith steadies resolve. We continue forward. You empower us. Lord, trusting you allows emotional healing to continue naturally. Psalm 147:3 reminds us that you heal gently. Healing does not require force. Trust allows patience. Pain softens gradually. Strength returns quietly. You remain near. Father, trusting you also reassures us that our future remains secure. Proverbs 16:9 reminds us again that you direct our steps. Security flows from guidance. Fear diminishes. Confidence grows. Peace remains steady. You lead faithfully. Lord, trusting you anchors us when doubts try to unsettle faith. Mark 9:24 reminds us that even imperfect faith is heard. Trust does not demand perfection. Sincerity matters. Growth continues. Grace sustains us. You strengthen belief. Father, trusting you restores inner calm during emotional storms. Psalm 29:11 reminds us that you bless with peace. Peace flows inwardly. Anxiety fades gradually. Trust deepens steadily. Stability returns. You remain faithful. Lord, trusting you allows us to face tomorrow without fear. Matthew 6:34 reminds us to focus on today. Trust simplifies perspective. Worry loosens. Peace fills awareness. Confidence remains firm. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you teaches us to remain composed when life demands patience beyond what feels comfortable. Psalm 37:7 reminds us to be still before you and wait patiently without frustration. Stillness is not weakness, but strength under control. Trust allows patience to mature without bitterness. We stop measuring progress by speed alone. Peace replaces restlessness. You steady our hearts. Father, when the pressure to have everything figured out grows intense, you invite us to rest in your wisdom. Proverbs 3:5 reminds us again not to lean on our own understanding. Understanding is limited, but your insight is complete. Trust releases the burden of needing all the answers. Calm settles where surrender exists. Confidence grows quietly. You guide perfectly. Lord, trusting you also teaches us to move forward, even when clarity arrives gradually. Psalm 119:30 reminds us that the unfolding of your word gives light. Light comes step by step, not all at once. Trust teaches us to walk with partial visibility. Fear fades when faith leads. Peace confirms each step. You illuminate the path. Father, when discouragement tries to convince us that our efforts are insignificant, you remind us that faithfulness carries eternal value. 1 Corinthians 15:58 assures us that labor done for you is never in vain. Trust keeps us committed even when recognition is absent. You see what others overlook. Reward is certain. Perseverance matters deeply. You honor consistency. Lord, trusting you stabilizes our emotions when expectations remain unmet. Psalm 62:5 reminds us to rest in you alone. Rest replaces striving. Trust quiets internal pressure. We stop forcing outcomes. Peace becomes our anchor. You sustain us patiently. Father, trusting you also reshapes how we interpret hardship. 1 Peter 5:10 reminds us that after suffering, you restore and strengthen us. Restoration follows endurance. Trust keeps us from interpreting pain as punishment. Growth unfolds through pressure. Strength emerges quietly. You complete the work you begin. Lord, trusting you guards our hearts against resentment when life feels unfair. Romans 12:12 encourages patience in affliction. Patience grows through trust. Resentment loses power. Peace remains intact. We release bitterness. You heal us fully. Father, when uncertainty clouds our decisions, you remind us that guidance flows from trust. Psalm 25:9 tells us, you guide the humble. Humility opens the door to clarity. Trust positions our hearts correctly. Confusion fades. Direction becomes evident. You lead gently. Lord, trusting you renews courage when fear of failure arises. Psalm 27:1 reminds us that you are our light and salvation. Fear retreats where confidence in you grows. Courage strengthens gradually. We move forward boldly. Trust stabilizes our resolve. You empower us. Father, trusting you allows us to remain hopeful when circumstances lag behind expectation. Romans 5:5 reminds us that hope does not disappoint. Trust sustains hope through delay. Faith remains active. Joy survives uncertainty. Peace accompanies waiting. You remain faithful. Lord, trusting you also teaches us emotional resilience during repeated challenges. 2 Corinthians 4:8-9 reminds us that though pressed, we are not crushed. Resilience grows through trust. Pressure does not define us. Strength develops quietly. Endurance remains steady. You uphold us. Father, trusting you nurtures gratitude even when life feels ordinary. Psalm 118:24 invites rejoicing in today. Gratitude transforms perspective. Trust reveals value in the present moment. Joy becomes accessible. Contentment grows naturally. You fill our hearts. Lord, trusting you protects our hearts from anxiety about provision. Luke 12:24 reminds us that you provide abundantly. Provision follows trust. Fear loosens its grip. Peace settles deeply. Confidence increases. You sustain us. Father, trusting you also builds patience in relationships that require grace. Ephesians 4:2 calls us to gentleness. Trust softens reactions. Compassion increases. Peace governs interactions. Healing unfolds gradually. You shape our hearts. Lord, trusting you steadies our minds when information feels overwhelming. Isaiah 26:3 reminds us again of perfect peace for minds fixed on you. Focus determines peace. Trust redirects attention. Anxiety fades gradually. Calm becomes natural. You remain near. Father, trusting you restores hope during seasons of emotional fatigue. Psalm 42:5 encourages hope in you. Hope lifts heavy spirits. Trust renews inner strength. Perspective widens. Joy returns gently. You restore us. Lord, trusting you teaches us to release fear of tomorrow. Matthew 6:34 reminds us again to focus on today. Trust simplifies life. Worry loosens. Peace fills awareness. Confidence remains strong. You guide our future. Father, trusting you also renews motivation when progress feels slow. Galatians 6:9 reminds us not to grow weary. Persistence matters deeply. Trust fuels endurance. Strength returns gradually. Reward remains certain. You honor faithfulness. Lord, trusting you calms our hearts when plans change unexpectedly. Proverbs 16:9 reminds us that you direct our steps. Direction remains secure. Trust steadies reactions. Fear diminishes. Confidence grows. You remain in control. Father, trusting you strengthens inner peace during external chaos. John 16:33 assures us of peace despite trouble. Peace resides internally. Trust guards our hearts. Anxiety fades. Courage remains steady. You have overcome. Lord, trusting you allows us to remain confident even when progress is invisible. Hebrews 11:1 reminds us that faith is assurance. Assurance replaces doubt. Trust sustains belief. Hope remains alive. Peace fills waiting moments. You are faithful. Father, trusting you reminds us that nothing we face is wasted. Psalm 66:10 reminds us of refinement. Refinement produces strength. Trust accepts process. Growth continues quietly. Purpose unfolds. You work skillfully. Lord, trusting you anchors our hearts during seasons of reflection. Lamentations 3:40 encourages examination and return. Trust invites renewal. Perspective shifts. Peace settles. Hope strengthens. You restore us. Father, trusting you reassures us that you walk with us continually. Deuteronomy 31:6 reminds us, you never leave us. Presence defeats fear. Trust deepens security. Confidence grows. Peace prevails. You remain faithful. Lord, trusting you allows rest to settle deeply within. Psalm 4:8 reminds us again of peaceful rest. Rest restores strength. Trust calms thoughts. Peace fills our hearts. Assurance remains steady. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you teaches us to remain anchored when life stretches our faith longer than expected. Psalm 31:24 reminds us to be strong and take heart as we wait for you. Waiting does not weaken trust when hope is anchored correctly. Strength grows quietly through patience. Faith matures beneath the surface. We remain confident even without visible movement. You are still working. Father, when our thoughts feel crowded with uncertainty, you invite us to rest in the truth of your guidance. Proverbs 20:24 reminds us that our steps are directed by you. Direction does not depend on our clarity. Trust allows peace to replace confusion. We move forward without panic. Confidence builds gradually. You remain in control. Lord, trusting you reshapes how we view moments of stillness. Psalm 46:10 again reminds us to be still and recognize your authority. Stillness becomes strength when trust is present. We do not fear inactivity. You work even when we pause. Calm deepens our awareness. Peace settles naturally. You reign above it all. Father, when emotional strain feels heavy, you restore balance through your presence. Psalm 94:19 assures us that when anxiety multiplies, your comfort delights our soul. Comfort flows where trust exists. Anxiety loosens its grip. Relief enters quietly. Strength is renewed inwardly. You soothe our hearts. Lord, trusting you teaches us resilience when pressure does not lift immediately. James 1:3 reminds us that the testing of faith produces perseverance. Perseverance is built through repeated trust. Endurance grows steadily. We do not collapse under weight. Strength multiplies quietly. You fortify us. Father, when disappointment attempts to shape our outlook. You restore hope through your promises. Psalm 33:18 reminds us that you watch over those who hope in you. Hope anchored in trust remains alive. Disappointment loses authority. Perspective widens. Expectation returns gently. You remain faithful. Lord, trusting you protects our hearts from fear-driven decisions. Proverbs 3:7 encourages us not to rely on our own wisdom. Trust slows impulsive reactions. Wisdom replaces haste. Peace governs our choices. Direction remains clear. You guide us gently. Father, trusting you allows patience to grow where frustration once lived. Romans 12:12 encourages patience in affliction. Patience matures through trust. Emotional tension softens. Calm steadies our reactions. Hope remains active. You strengthen us daily. Lord, trusting you restores confidence when self-doubt surfaces. Psalm 138:8 reminds us that you will fulfill your purpose for us. Purpose is not threatened by doubt. Trust reinforces identity. Confidence grows quietly. Assurance replaces insecurity. You complete what you begin. Father, trusting you nurtures peace during seasons of unpredictability. Isaiah 32:17 reminds us that righteousness produces peace and quietness. Peace flows from alignment with you. Trust stabilizes emotions. Anxiety diminishes gradually. Calm becomes consistent. You uphold us. Lord, trusting you strengthens faith during long journeys. Hebrews 10:23 encourages holding firmly to hope. Faith is sustained through trust. We do not abandon expectation. Endurance becomes natural. Hope remains resilient. You remain trustworthy. Father, trusting you also cultivates gratitude in moments of simplicity. Psalm 107:1 reminds us to give thanks for your goodness. Gratitude deepens trust. Contentment grows steadily. Joy becomes accessible. Perspective shifts gently. You fill our hearts. Lord, trusting you guards our hearts from discouragement when results feel distant. Galatians 6:9 reminds us that we will reap in due season. Trust keeps us faithful. Weariness does not define us. Strength returns gradually. Reward remains sure. You honor perseverance. Father, trusting you brings calm to our minds when information overload creates anxiety. Isaiah 26:3 again reminds us of perfect peace through focus on you. Focus realigns thoughts. Trust quiets mental noise. Peace settles deeply. Calm becomes natural. You remain present. Lord, trusting you also teaches us humility during success and patience during delay. Proverbs 16:18 warns against pride. Trust keeps our hearts grounded. Balance remains intact. Growth continues healthily. You shape character wisely. You remain our guide. Father, trusting you restores courage when fear of failure arises again. Psalm 56:3 reminds us to trust when afraid. Courage grows through reliance. Fear loses dominance. Confidence stabilizes. Strength returns quietly. You support us. Lord, trusting you renews emotional strength after prolonged waiting. Isaiah 40:29 reminds us, you give strength to the weary. Renewal unfolds gradually. Trust allows restoration. Energy returns gently. Hope remains alive. You sustain us. Father, trusting you teaches us to release control over timing. Ecclesiastes 3:1 reminds us that every season has purpose. Trust accepts timing without resistance. Peace replaces impatience. Wisdom grows through surrender. Alignment deepens. You orchestrate perfectly. Lord, trusting you steadies our hearts during relational strain. Colossians 3:13 encourages forgiveness and patience. Trust softens reactions. Grace governs responses. Healing unfolds gently. Peace replaces tension. You shape relationships. Father, trusting you also renews clarity when direction feels blurred. Psalm 119:33 asks you to direct our steps. Direction flows through trust. Confusion fades gradually. Confidence builds. Peace confirms movement. You guide faithfully. Lord, trusting you protects our hope during seasons of unanswered prayer. Psalm 41 reminds us again of waiting patiently. Waiting does not cancel faith. Trust sustains expectation. Hope remains alive. Strength grows quietly. You hear us, Father. Trusting you reassures us of your constant presence. Joshua 1:9 again reminds us that you are with us wherever we go. Presence defeats fear. Trust deepens security. Confidence grows. Peace prevails. You never leave us, Lord. Trusting you allows us to rest in the present without fear of the future. Matthew 6:34 again reminds us to focus on today. Trust simplifies perspective. Worry loosens. Peace fills awareness. Confidence remains firm. You guide tomorrow. Father, trusting you anchors our hearts when emotions fluctuate. Psalm 62:6 reminds us that you are our rock. Stability flows from trust. Fear loses power. Calm becomes steady. Assurance remains strong. You are faithful. Lord, trusting you leads us into deeper peace and assurance. Philippians 4:7 reminds us of peace, guarding our hearts and minds. Peace stands watch over our thoughts. Trust deepens daily. Calm becomes natural. Hope remains steady. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you teaches our hearts to remain calm when progress feels slower than we expected. Psalm 48 reminds us that delighting in your will reshapes our patience. Patience is not passive resignation, but active confidence in you. Trust steadies our emotions while time unfolds. We resist the urge to rush outcomes. Peace grows where trust governs. You remain at work, Father, when uncertainty tries to create anxiety about the future. You remind us that you already stand there with authority. Isaiah 46:10 declares that you make known the end from the beginning. Nothing ahead is hidden from you. Trust allows us to face tomorrow without fear. Confidence grows as we remember your sovereignty. Calm replaces speculation. You guide all things. Lord, trusting you also reframes how we view moments of silence. Lamentations 3:26 reminds us that it is good to wait quietly for you. Silence does not mean absence. It often means preparation. Trust helps us listen instead of assume. Stillness sharpens discernment. Peace settles deeply. You are near. Father, when emotional fatigue lingers, you offer renewal through quiet dependence. Psalm 23:3 reminds us that you restore our soul. Restoration does not demand urgency. Trust allows healing to unfold naturally. Strength returns gradually. Weariness loosens its grip. You refresh us gently. Lord, trusting you strengthens us to remain faithful during unseen seasons. Colossians 3:23 reminds us to work with sincerity as unto you. Faithfulness is valuable even without visibility. Trust keeps us committed when applause is absent. Purpose continues beneath the surface. Integrity grows quietly. You see everything. Father, when fear attempts to exaggerate risk, you remind us of your protection. Psalm 121:7 assures us that you keep us from harm. Protection flows from your care. Trust calms anxious projections. Security becomes internal. Peace stabilizes our thoughts. You guard us completely. Lord, trusting you steadies our emotions when expectations shift unexpectedly. Proverbs 16:3 encourages committing our plans to you. Commitment replaces control. Trust releases pressure. Peace accompanies surrender. Confidence grows inwardly. You direct outcomes. Father, trusting you also nurtures resilience during repeated challenges. 2 Corinthians 1:10 reminds us that you deliver and will deliver again. Past rescue fuels present trust. Hope strengthens through memory. Endurance becomes natural. Faith remains steady. You remain faithful. Lord, trusting you allows us to respond gently rather than defensively. Proverbs 15:1 reminds us that gentle responses diffuse tension. Trust governs tone and timing. Wisdom shapes reactions. Peace replaces impulsiveness. Relationships benefit from restraint. You refine our character. Father, when self-doubt tries to weaken confidence, you remind us of our identity in you. Romans 8:16 assures us that we are your children. Belonging strengthens trust. Confidence returns quietly. Fear loses authority. Assurance grows steadily. You affirm us. Lord, trusting you also teaches us to value obedience over immediate success. Deuteronomy 5:33 reminds us that walking in your ways leads to life. Obedience remains meaningful regardless of outcome. Trust honors alignment. Peace follows faithfulness. Direction remains clear. You bless obedience. Father, trusting you restores joy when routine feels heavy. Psalm 16:11 reminds us that joy is found in your presence. Presence renews perspective. Trust invites joy back into ordinary moments. Gratitude grows naturally. Lightness returns gradually. You refresh us. Lord, trusting you calms our hearts when news or circumstances feel unsettling. Psalm 112:7 reminds us again not to fear bad news. Trust stabilizes reactions. Calm replaces alarm. Confidence remains intact. Peace governs our response. You remain in control. Father, trusting you renews strength when mental fatigue clouds focus. Isaiah 26:3 again reminds us of perfect peace through focus on you. Focus brings peace. Trust quiets distractions. Clarity returns slowly. Calm becomes consistent. You steady us. Lord, trusting you also protects us from despair when answers feel delayed. Psalm 27:14 encourages courage while waiting. Courage grows through trust. Hope remains alive. Faith does not collapse. Endurance strengthens. You remain near. Father, trusting you allows emotional healing to continue without resistance. Psalm 47:3 reminds us again of your gentle healing. Healing flows where trust lives. Pain softens gradually. Strength rebuilds quietly. Peace replaces tension. You restore completely. Lord, trusting you steadies our hearts during transitions we did not anticipate. Isaiah 30:21 assures us of your guidance. Direction remains present, even in change. Trust calms uncertainty. Confidence builds gradually. Fear fades. You lead faithfully. Father, trusting you renews patience in relationships that require grace. Ephesians 4:2 calls us to gentleness and patience. Trust softens our reactions. Compassion replaces frustration. Peace governs interactions. Healing unfolds slowly. You shape our hearts. Lord, trusting you reassures us when progress feels invisible. Hebrews 11:6 reminds us that you reward those who seek you. Seeking remains valuable. Trust sustains pursuit. Faith remains active. Hope strengthens quietly. You see our faith. Father, trusting you guards our hearts from anxiety about provision. Psalm 34:10 assures us that those who seek you lack no good thing. Provision follows trust. Fear loosens its grip. Gratitude grows steadily. Confidence increases. You provide faithfully. Lord, trusting you nurtures inner stability when emotions fluctuate. Psalm 62 reminds us that you are our fortress. Stability flows from trust. Fear loses influence. Calm becomes steady. Assurance remains strong. You uphold us. Father, trusting you restores clarity when direction feels uncertain. Proverbs 4:11 reminds us that you lead us in wisdom. Wisdom emerges through trust. Confusion fades gradually. Peace confirms steps. Confidence grows. You guide consistently. Lord, trusting you renews hope when outcomes feel distant. Romans 15:13 reminds us that you fill us with hope through trust. Hope strengthens endurance. Faith remains alive. Peace fills waiting moments. Assurance grows steadily. You are faithful. Father, trusting you allows us to remain calm under pressure. Psalm 46:1 reminds us that you are our refuge and strength. Refuge brings security. Trust settles our nerves. Courage strengthens quietly. Peace prevails. You remain close. Lord, trusting you anchors our hearts against fear of the future. Jeremiah 29:11 reminds us of your plans for hope. Trust steadies expectation. Anxiety fades gradually. Confidence remains firm. Hope stands strong. You guide our future. Father, trusting you leads us into deeper rest and assurance. Hebrews 4:9 reminds us that rest remains for your people. Rest flows from trust. Striving ends. Peace settles deeply. Confidence holds steady. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you teaches our hearts to remain deeply settled, even when circumstances continue to test our patience beyond what feels reasonable, because your word reminds us that those who trust in you will never be put to shame. Psalm 25:3 declares that no one who hopes in you will ever be disgraced, and this truth anchors our spirit when outcomes seem delayed. Trust does not mean denying reality, but choosing to believe that reality is still unfolding under your authority. Even when we do not see progress immediately, you are arranging details beyond our awareness. Faith grows strongest when trust persists without visible reassurance. Calm replaces tension as we remember your faithfulness. You are still working. Father, when our emotions feel stretched thin by repeated waiting and unanswered questions, you invite us to anchor our thoughts in the certainty of who you are, rather than what we feel. Isaiah 28:16 reminds us that the one who trusts in you will never panic, even when pressure builds relentlessly. Panic fades when trust becomes deliberate and practiced. We slow our thoughts and steady our breathing by returning to your promises. Emotional stability grows when faith becomes habitual rather than reactive. Peace begins to govern our inner world. You remain unshaken. Lord, trusting you reshapes how we interpret silence, teaching us that quiet seasons are not empty but deeply formative, refining our character in ways that visible success never could. Psalm 62:1 declares that our soul finds rest in you alone, not in answers or outcomes. Rest becomes possible when trust replaces striving. We stop forcing clarity and allow wisdom to mature naturally. Inner strength develops quietly during these moments. Anxiety loses its grip as rest deepens. You are present even in the quiet. Father, when discouragement tries to convince us that effort without reward is meaningless, you remind us that obedience always carries eternal value even when results are delayed. Hebrews 11:6 teaches that you reward those who diligently seek you, even when the reward is not immediate. Trust sustains our commitment when motivation feels fragile. We continue faithfully because our confidence is rooted in you, not in outcomes. Perseverance becomes an act of worship. Strength grows through consistency. You see every step. Lord, trusting you stabilizes our hearts when disappointment threatens to harden our expectations, reminding us that disappointment does not disqualify destiny when faith remains alive. Romans 5:4 reminds us that endurance produces character, and character produces hope that does not disappoint. Trust reframes hardship as preparation rather than punishment. We release bitterness and choose belief again. Hope strengthens slowly but surely. Perspective widens as faith matures. You are shaping something greater. Father, when uncertainty surrounds decisions and the fear of making the wrong choice feels overwhelming, you reassure us that you direct the paths of those who trust you fully. Proverbs 16:9 reminds us that while we plan our way, you establish our steps with precision. Trust allows us to move forward without paralyzing fear. Peace confirms direction even before certainty arrives. Confidence replaces hesitation. We walk guided rather than rushed. You lead wisely. Lord, trusting you guards our hearts against emotional exhaustion that comes from carrying burdens we were never meant to hold alone. Psalm 55:22 reminds us to cast our burdens on you, trusting that you will sustain us fully. Relief begins the moment surrender becomes genuine. Emotional weight lightens as trust deepens. Strength returns gradually. Calm settles within us. You carry what we release. Father, trusting you renews our courage when fear whispers that the future may hold more difficulty than we can manage. Deuteronomy 31:6 reminds us to be strong and courageous because you go with us wherever we go. Courage grows when trust becomes anchored in your presence rather than in favorable circumstances. Fear loses influence when companionship is assured. Confidence strengthens our resolve. We move forward without dread. You are with us. Lord, trusting you restores emotional balance when progress appears inconsistent, teaching us that growth is not always visible but is always occurring under your care. Mark 4:27 reminds us that growth happens even when we sleep and do not see it. Trust allows patience with the process. We resist the urge to measure growth by comparison. Faithfulness remains our focus. Peace replaces frustration. You are cultivating maturity. Father, when self-doubt tries to undermine our confidence, you remind us that our identity is rooted in your calling, not in our performance. Isaiah 41:10 reassures us that you strengthen and uphold us with your righteous hand. Trust stabilizes identity. Confidence grows inwardly rather than externally. Fear of failure fades. Assurance becomes firm. You uphold us steadily. Lord, trusting you also softens our hearts in relationships, helping us respond with grace rather than defensiveness when misunderstanding arises. Colossians 3:12 encourages compassion, humility, and patience, all of which grow naturally when trust governs the heart. Reactions slow. Wisdom shapes our words. Peace governs interactions. Healing becomes possible. Unity strengthens gradually. You shape our character. Father, trusting you restores peace when anxiety attempts to dominate our thoughts through imagined outcomes and worst-case scenarios. Isaiah 26:3 promises perfect peace to those whose minds are stayed on you. Trust redirects focus away from fear. Calm replaces mental noise. Thoughts become grounded. Peace stabilizes the mind. You guard our inner world. Lord, trusting you strengthens perseverance when the journey feels longer than expected, reminding us that endurance is not weakness, but spiritual strength, refined through faith. Hebrews 12:11 reminds us that discipline produces a harvest of righteousness and peace. Trust allows endurance to mature us rather than exhaust us. We remain committed. Hope stays alive. Strength builds quietly. You reward perseverance. Father, trusting you renews joy when routine threatens to dull our spirit, reminding us that joy is rooted in relationship rather than excitement. Psalm 16:11 reminds us that fullness of joy is found in your presence. Trust invites joy back into ordinary moments. Gratitude reshapes perspective. Lightness returns slowly. Peace accompanies contentment. You refresh our hearts. Lord, trusting you steadies us during emotional transitions, reminding us that change does not remove your guidance or protection. Isaiah 43:2 assures us that you walk with us through waters and fires alike. Transition does not equal abandonment. Trust reassures us of continuity. Confidence grows despite change. Fear diminishes. You remain constant. Father, trusting you protects our hearts from despair when answers feel delayed, reminding us that delay is not denial in your perfect timing. Lamentations 3:25 reminds us that you are good to those who wait for you. Trust sustains patience. Hope remains active. Faith does not collapse. Peace deepens. You are faithful. Lord, trusting you nurtures patience within us, teaching us that rushing often disrupts what waiting would perfect. Psalm 27:14 encourages us to wait on you and be strong. Strength develops through trust. Impatience fades gradually, confidence stabilizes, wisdom matures. You order our steps. Father, trusting you calms fear related to provision, reminding us that our needs are known and cared for by you long before we ask. Matthew 6:32 reminds us that you know what we need before we speak. Trust quiets worry. Gratitude replaces anxiety. Assurance grows. Peace settles. You provide faithfully. Lord, trusting you restores hope when setbacks attempt to define our future, reminding us that setbacks refine direction rather than counsel purpose. Micah 7:8 reminds us that even if we fall, we will rise again. Trust lifts us from discouragement. Momentum returns slowly. Confidence rebuilds. Faith remains alive. You restore. Father, trusting you steadies our hearts during seasons of reflection, when growth feels internal rather than visible. Psalm 139:23 invites you to search our hearts and lead us in the way everlasting. Trust welcomes refinement. Clarity deepens. Peace replaces restlessness. Growth becomes evident internally. You guide gently. Lord, trusting you protects our hope when voices of doubt attempt to overshadow truth, reminding us that your word remains final. Romans 8:31 reminds us that if you are for us, no opposition can ultimately prevail. Trust silences fear. Confidence strengthens. Assurance becomes firm. Peace remains steady. You are faithful. Father, trusting you allows us to rest in the present moment without fear of what lies ahead, because we know you are already there. Psalm 21:8 reminds us that you watch over our coming and going now and forever. Security settles deeply. Anxiety fades gradually. Peace fills awareness. Confidence holds steady. You guard us. Lord, trusting you anchors our hearts in the certainty that nothing unfolding now is beyond your redemptive power. Jeremiah 29:11 reminds us again that your plans are for hope and a future. Trust steady as expectation. Fear loses authority. Hope remains alive. Peace governs our hearts. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you teaches our hearts to remain steady when the journey stretches longer than we expected and the destination feels distant, because faith is refined, not in arrival, but in endurance. Psalm 37:5 reminds us to commit our way to you and trust you to act, even when progress appears hidden. Trust is not passive waiting, but active confidence that you are moving even when we cannot trace your hand. Our hearts learn stability by leaning into your promises repeatedly. Anxiety weakens as surrender strengthens. Peace becomes rooted rather than temporary. You remain faithful throughout every stage. Father, when our minds replay worries and imagine outcomes that have not yet happened, you gently remind us that fear thrives where trust is neglected. Isaiah 41:10 reassures us not to fear because you strengthen, help, and uphold us with unwavering care. Trust interrupts cycles of anxious thinking. Our thoughts slow as truth replaces speculation. Calm begins to settle where fear once dominated. Emotional clarity returns gradually. You hold us securely. Lord, trusting you reshapes how we interpret waiting, helping us understand that waiting is not stagnation, but preparation occurring beneath the surface. Psalm 135 reminds us that we wait for you with hope, anchored in your word. Hope remains alive, even when movement feels minimal. Trust keeps our spirit engaged, rather than discouraged. We resist rushing what you are refining. Strength develops quietly during delay. You are preparing us wisely. Father, when disappointment threatens to drain our motivation, you restore perspective by reminding us that faithfulness is never wasted. 1 Corinthians 15:58 reminds us that our labor in you is never in vain, even when results are delayed. Trust sustains obedience beyond emotion. Commitment deepens when outcomes remain unseen. Perseverance becomes an act of devotion. Hope strengthens through consistency. You honor endurance. Lord, trusting you protects our hearts from becoming hardened by unmet expectations. teaching us that unmet expectations often redirect us toward better alignment. Proverbs 19:21 reminds us that your purpose prevails despite our plans. Trust releases attachment to specific outcomes. Peace replaces resistance. Flexibility grows where faith leads. Confidence returns through surrender. You redirect us with wisdom. Father, trusting you steadies us when internal conflict arises between what we desire and what we must release. Psalm 62:5 reminds us to rest in you alone, not in circumstances or control. Rest becomes possible when trust deepens. Emotional tension eases as surrender increases. Clarity replaces confusion. Calm governs our reactions. You remain our anchor. Lord, trusting you strengthens resilience when repeated challenges threaten to erode confidence, reminding us that endurance builds spiritual depth. Romans 8:25 teaches us to wait patiently for what we hope for. Waiting refines character rather than weakening it. Trust sustains faith through repetition. Strength matures quietly. Hope becomes resilient rather than fragile. You are shaping perseverance. Father, trusting you also softens our hearts toward others, especially when relationships feel strained or misunderstood. Ephesians 4:31-32 encourages forgiveness and compassion rooted in grace. Trust prevents bitterness from taking root. Emotional defenses lower gradually. Healing begins through patience. Peace replaces resentment. You restore connection gently. Lord, trusting you guards our minds when external voices attempt to influence our peace and direction. Psalm 118:8 reminds us that trusting you is safer than trusting human opinion. Trust stabilizes identity. Confidence grows internally. Fear of judgment fades. Assurance becomes firm. You remain our source. Father, trusting you renews courage when fear of the unknown tries to dominate our thoughts. Joshua 1:9 reminds us again that you are with us wherever we go. Courage grows when presence is acknowledged. Fear diminishes gradually. Confidence stabilizes our steps. We move forward with resolve. You accompany us. Lord, trusting you restores emotional balance when circumstances feel unstable and unpredictable. Psalm 112:6 reminds us that the righteous will not be shaken. Stability flows from trust rather than certainty. Calm settles into our inner world. Anxiety loosens its grip. Peace becomes consistent. You uphold us. Father, trusting you reframes hardship as refinement rather than punishment, helping us grow without resentment. 1 Peter 1:6-7 reminds us that trials refine faith like gold. Trust allows refinement to occur without resistance. Strength increases gradually. Character matures quietly. Hope remains active. You refine us skillfully. Lord, trusting you renews joy when heaviness lingers longer than expected. Psalm 30:11 reminds us that you turn mourning into joy. Joy returns gradually through trust. Perspective shifts gently. Lightness replaces heaviness. Gratitude resurfaces. You restore emotional vitality. Father, trusting you steadies us when our sense of direction feels unclear and decisions feel overwhelming. Proverbs 3:6 reminds us to acknowledge you so you can direct our paths. Direction flows from surrender. Trust quiets overthinking. Clarity emerges slowly. Peace confirms steps. You guide faithfully. Lord, trusting you protects our peace when news or circumstances threaten to disturb emotional stability. John 14:27 reminds us that your peace is not like the world's peace. Trust anchors peace internally. Fear loses authority. Calm governs reactions. Confidence remains intact. You remain sovereign. Father, trusting you allows healing to continue gently without forcing emotional resolution prematurely. Psalm 147:3 reminds us again that you heal the broken-hearted. Healing unfolds through patience. Trust creates safety for restoration. Pain softens gradually. Strength returns quietly. You remain compassionate. Lord, trusting you nurtures patience when growth feels internal rather than visible. Galatians 5:22 reminds us that patience is fruit produced through faith. Trust sustains growth during quiet seasons. We resist comparison. Progress continues unseen. Faith matures deeply. You cultivate fruit. Father, trusting you renews our confidence when self-doubt attempts to undermine identity. Romans 8:1 reminds us there is no condemnation in you. Trust affirms acceptance. Shame loses influence. Confidence rebuilds gradually. Peace replaces insecurity. You affirm our worth. Lord, trusting you strengthens endurance during prolonged seasons of uncertainty. Hebrews 10:36 reminds us that perseverance is required to receive promises. Trust fuels endurance. Giving up loses appeal. Faith remains active. Hope stays alive. You reward perseverance. Father, trusting you steadies us during moments of reflection and self-examination. Psalm 26:2 invites you to test our hearts and minds. Trust welcomes refinement. Clarity deepens inwardly. Peace replaces defensiveness. Growth becomes intentional. You guide gently. Lord, trusting you calms fear related to provision and future needs. Matthew 6:26 reminds us of your attentive care. Trust quiets worry. Gratitude replaces anxiety. Confidence strengthens. Peace settles deeply. You provide faithfully. Father, trusting you restores emotional strength when weariness threatens motivation. Isaiah 40:31 reminds us again that those who hope in you renew their strength. Renewal unfolds gradually. Trust sustains energy. Fatigue loosens its grip. Strength returns steadily. You restore us. Lord, trusting you anchors our hearts against fear of tomorrow, reminding us that tomorrow is already held securely in your care. Psalm 39:16 reminds us that our days are written by you. Trust releases future anxiety. Peace fills the present. Confidence remains firm. Assurance deepens. You govern time. Father, trusting you brings inner stability, even when external conditions remain uncertain. Psalm 46:1 reminds us that you are our refuge and strength. Refuge brings security. Trust settles emotions. Calm prevails. Hope remains strong. You remain near. Lord, trusting you reassures us that nothing unfolding now will overpower your purpose for our lives. Romans 8:38-39 reminds us, nothing separates us from your love. Love anchors trust. Fear dissolves gradually. Confidence remains steady. Peace governs our hearts. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you teaches our hearts to remain deeply anchored, even when life feels uncertain and our strength feels tested beyond familiar limits. Because true trust is revealed when circumstances offer no reassurance. Psalm 62:8 reminds us to trust in you at all times and pour out our hearts before you, knowing that you are our refuge. Trust is not silence toward pain, but surrender of control. We bring every concern honestly, without fear of rejection. Emotional weight begins to lift when surrender becomes sincere. Peace grows where honesty meets faith. You remain our safe place. Father, when our thoughts become restless and our minds struggle to find calm, you invite us to redirect our focus from fear to truth that does not change. Isaiah 26:12 reminds us that you establish peace for us, because all that we have accomplished has been done through you. Trust interrupts the cycle of anxious overthinking. Calm returns gradually as truth replaces assumption. Stability grows from remembering your sovereignty. Our hearts slow down in your presence. You restore balance gently. Lord, trusting you reshapes how we interpret uncertainty, teaching us that not knowing everything does not mean danger, but dependence on divine wisdom. Deuteronomy 29 reminds us that some things belong to you alone, while what is revealed belongs to us. Trust allows us to live peacefully without demanding full understanding. We release the pressure to control outcomes. Faith matures when mystery is embraced without fear. Confidence grows quietly. You remain trustworthy beyond our comprehension. Father, when disappointment lingers and emotions feel heavy from repeated delays, you remind us that hope anchored in you will never be wasted. Romans 5:5 assures us that hope does not put us to shame, because your love has been poured into our hearts. Trust sustains hope during prolonged waiting. Discouragement loses influence where faith remains active. Strength builds slowly through perseverance. Joy begins to return quietly. You are faithful in every season. Lord, trusting you protects our hearts from emotional burnout that comes from carrying expectations we were never meant to hold alone. Matthew 11:29 invites us to learn from you because you are gentle and humble in heart. Trust teaches us to rest without guilt. We release pressure that drains our spirit. Renewal unfolds gradually. Strength returns in waves. You restore us with compassion. Father, trusting you also teaches us to value obedience over urgency, reminding us that timing is part of wisdom, not delay. Ecclesiastes 3:11 reminds us that you make everything beautiful in its time. Trust allows us to wait without resentment. Beauty unfolds through patience. Peace grows where timing is respected. Anxiety fades slowly. You orchestrate all things wisely. Lord, trusting you steadies our hearts when emotions fluctuate unexpectedly and internal balance feels fragile. Psalm 131:2 describes a soul calmed and quieted like a child with its mother. Trust nurtures emotional maturity. Reactivity fades as calm deepens. We learn to respond rather than react. Peace governs our inner world. You hold us gently. Father, when fear tries to magnify imagined outcomes, you remind us that fear is never stronger than truth. Psalm 56:3 reminds us that whenever we are afraid, we choose to trust in you. Trust becomes an intentional decision rather than an emotion. Fear loosens its grip gradually. Courage strengthens quietly. Our thoughts regain clarity. You remain present. Lord, trusting you renews perseverance when progress feels invisible and effort feels unnoticed. Hebrews 6:10 reminds us that you are not unjust to forget our work and love. Trust keeps us faithful in unseen seasons. Commitment deepens without recognition. Endurance matures silently. Hope remains alive. You see every step. Father, trusting you also restores confidence when past failures try to define our future. Micah 7:8 reminds us that though we fall, we will rise again. Trust refuses to let failure have the final word. Confidence rebuilds gradually. Shame loses authority. Forward movement becomes possible again. You restore with grace. Lord, trusting you steadies us when relationships feel strained and misunderstandings linger longer than expected. Romans 12:18 encourages us to live at peace as much as possible. Trust allows patience to replace frustration. Compassion grows where grace is practiced. Healing unfolds without force. Peace becomes attainable. You soften hearts. Father, trusting you calms fear related to provision and security when resources feel uncertain. Psalm 34:10 reminds us that those who seek you lack no good thing. Trust quiets financial anxiety. Gratitude replaces worry. Confidence grows steadily. Peace fills our thoughts. You provide faithfully. Lord, trusting you protects our minds when external noise tries to distract us from truth. Psalm 46:1 reminds us that you are our refuge and strength, always present in trouble. Trust anchors attention. Distraction fades gradually. Focus returns inwardly. Calm becomes stable. You remain our refuge. Father, trusting you teaches us to remain gentle with ourselves during seasons of internal growth. Psalm 103:13 reminds us that you have compassion for those who fear you. Trust allows grace toward imperfection. Progress continues without condemnation. Healing feels safe. Confidence grows patiently. You are kind. Lord, trusting you nurtures patience when answers do not arrive on our timeline. Habakkuk 2:3 reminds us that vision awaits the appointed time. and will not delay. Trust honors timing, without resentment. Expectation remains alive. Faith stays active. Peace settles during waiting. You are never late. Father, trusting you steadies our hearts when we feel emotionally exposed or vulnerable. Psalm 91:1 reminds us that those who dwell in you rest securely. Trust creates emotional safety. Fear fades gradually. Calm fills vulnerable spaces. Confidence returns gently. You cover us. Lord, trusting you restores joy when heaviness lingers longer than anticipated. Psalm 35 reminds us that joy comes in the morning. Trust holds hope through the night. Light returns gradually. Gratitude rises quietly. Emotional strength renews. You turn sorrow into joy. Father, trusting you helps us release fear about making mistakes or choosing the wrong path. Proverbs 16:9 reminds us again that you establish our steps. Trust allows movement without paralysis. Peace confirms direction. Confidence strengthens gradually. Fear loses control. You guide us. Lord, trusting you guards our hearts when the world feels unstable and unpredictable. John 16:33 reminds us that you have overcome the world. Trust anchors peace internally. Fear loses authority. Courage remains steady. Calm governs our reactions. You reign above chaos. Father, trusting you renews emotional strength when weariness threatens motivation. Isaiah 40:29 reminds us that you give strength to the weary. Trust sustains energy when effort feels heavy. Renewal unfolds gradually. Hope remains alive. Strength returns steadily. You uphold us. Lord, trusting you reassures us that nothing unfolding now is outside your redemptive plan. Romans 8:28 reminds us again that you work all things for good. Trust reframes difficulty. Purpose emerges through patience. Hope strengthens quietly. Peace deepens. You remain intentional. Father, trusting you steadies our hearts when reflection reveals areas still growing. Psalm 139:23 invites you to search our hearts. Trust welcomes refinement. Growth becomes intentional. Peace replaces defensiveness. Clarity deepens. You guide us gently. Lord, trusting you protects our hope from discouraging voices that question our faith. Isaiah 54:17 reminds us that no weapon formed against us will prevail. Trust silences doubt. Confidence grows inwardly. Assurance becomes firm. Peace remains steady. You defend us. Father, trusting you allows us to rest fully in the present moment without fear of what lies ahead. Matthew 6:34 reminds us again not to worry about tomorrow. Trust simplifies perspective. Anxiety loosens gradually. Calm fills awareness. Confidence remains firm. You hold tomorrow. Lord, trusting you anchors our hearts in the certainty that your plans will not fail, no matter how uncertain the path may appear. Jeremiah 29:11 reminds us that your plans are for hope and a future. Trust steadies expectation. Fear dissolves slowly. Peace governs our hearts. Hope remains alive. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you teaches our hearts to remain deeply rooted, even when life feels unfamiliar and the path ahead seems hidden behind uncertainty, because faith is strengthened when visibility is limited. Psalm 37:23 reminds us that the steps of those who trust you are ordered, even when the road appears unclear. Trust allows us to move forward without demanding certainty. Our confidence rests not in clarity, but in your guidance. Anxiety loosens its grip as reliance deepens. Peace grows quietly through surrender. You remain steady and sure. Father, when emotional exhaustion threatens our endurance, you remind us that strength does not come from striving, but from resting in you fully. Isaiah 30:15 tells us that in quietness and trust is our strength. Trust restores energy drained by worry. We release the need to control outcomes. Calm replaces inattention gradually. Strength renews from within. You sustain us gently. Lord, trusting you reshapes how we interpret moments of delay, helping us understand that delay often protects us from outcomes we cannot yet see. Psalm 27:14 encourages us to wait for you with courage. Trust transforms waiting into preparation. We resist rushing what you are refining. Patience becomes wisdom rather than weakness. Confidence remains alive. You are never late. Father, trusting you steadies our hearts when repeated challenges try to convince us that progress is impossible. Romans 8:37 reminds us that we are more than conquerors through you. Trust reframes difficulty as opportunity for growth. Hope strengthens where faith remains active. Fear loses influence gradually. Courage returns quietly. You empower us. Lord, trusting you protects our hearts from bitterness that arises when expectations are unmet. Hebrews 12:15 warns against bitterness taking root. Trust keeps our hearts open and soft. Forgiveness becomes possible through grace. Healing flows where surrender exists. Peace replaces resentment. You restore emotional freedom. Father, trusting you calms our minds when thoughts spiral into imagined futures filled with uncertainty. 2 Corinthians 10:5 reminds us to take every thought captive. Trust disciplines our thinking gently. Fear-driven imagination quiets down. Clarity replaces mental chaos. Peace settles steadily. You guard our minds. Lord, trusting you renews perseverance when faith feels tested by prolonged silence. Psalm 41 reminds us again that you hear those who wait patiently. Waiting strengthens trust rather than diminishing it. Faith deepens through endurance. Hope remains alive even in silence. Strength matures quietly. You remain attentive. Father, trusting you restores emotional stability when disappointment lingers longer than expected. Psalm 73:28 reminds us that nearness to you is our good. Trust draws us closer rather than pushing us away. Comfort flows from connection. Pain softens gradually. Peace replaces heaviness. You remain near. Lord, trusting you teaches us to respond with humility when pride tempts us to force outcomes prematurely. Proverbs 11:2 reminds us that wisdom accompanies humility. Trust releases control. Peace grows where humility lives. Direction becomes clearer. Confidence stabilizes. You guide wisely. Father, trusting you renews hope when setbacks attempt to define our identity. Isaiah 43:18 encourages us not to dwell on former things. Trust allows release of past disappointment. New perspective emerges. Hope strengthens gradually. Faith regains clarity. You are doing something new. Lord, trusting you steadies our hearts during seasons of transition that feel uncomfortable and uncertain. Psalm 32:8 assures us of your instruction and guidance. Trust calms fear of missteps. Confidence grows slowly. Peace confirms movement. Direction unfolds step by step. You lead faithfully. Father, trusting you also strengthens patience in relationships, requiring grace and understanding. Colossians 3:12 encourages patience, rooted in compassion. Trust softens reactions. Listening replaces defensiveness. Healing becomes possible. Peace governs interactions. You shape our hearts. Lord, trusting you protects our peace when external circumstances feel chaotic and unpredictable. John 14:27 reminds us again of peace, not dependent on the world. Trust anchors peace internally. Anxiety fades gradually. Calm becomes steady. Courage remains firm. You reign above all. Father, trusting you renews emotional strength when weariness begins to dull motivation. Psalm 84:5 reminds us that those whose strength is in you are blessed. Trust fuels perseverance. Energy returns quietly. Hope remains alive. Strength rebuilds gradually. You restore us. Lord, trusting you teaches us to accept refinement without resistance. Malachi 3:3 reminds us that you refine like silver. Trust allows growth through refinement. Character deepens quietly. Pride fades gradually. Wisdom increases. You purify gently. Father, trusting you reassures us that vulnerability does not equal weakness. 2 Corinthians 12:9 reminds us that your strength is made perfect in weakness. Trust allows honesty. Dependence replaces self-reliance. Peace grows where surrender exists. Strength manifests quietly. You uphold us, Lord. Trusting you guards our hearts when fear of failure tries to paralyze progress. Proverbs 24:16 reminds us that falling does not prevent rising again. Trust restores movement. Confidence rebuilds gradually. Shame loses authority. Hope remains active. You lift us. Father, trusting you nurtures patience when clarity unfolds slowly. Psalm 25:5 encourages us to wait for you all day long. Trust sustains expectation. Anxiety loosens gradually. Peace fills waiting moments. Faith remains strong. You reveal truth gently. Lord, trusting you restores joy when heaviness has lingered for too long. Isaiah 61:3 reminds us that you exchange heaviness for praise. Trust allows joy to return gradually. Perspective shifts gently. Gratitude resurfaces. Emotional balance restores. You renew us. Father, trusting you calms fear related to provision and security. Luke 12:32 reminds us not to fear because you delight in providing. Trust quiets. Worry. Assurance grows steadily. Peace fills our thoughts. Confidence strengthens. You provide abundantly. Lord, trusting you steadies us when internal growth feels uncomfortable. Psalm 66:10 reminds us that refinement leads to strength. Trust embraces process. Growth continues quietly. Perspective widens. Hope strengthens. You work purposefully. Father, trusting you protects our hope from discouraging voices that question progress. Romans 15:13 reminds us that you fill us with hope as we trust you. Trust strengthens endurance. Faith remains active. Peace fills waiting moments. Confidence remains firm. You are faithful. Lord, trusting you allows us to rest securely in the present without fear of tomorrow. Matthew 6:34 reminds us again to focus on today. Trust simplifies our outlook. Anxiety loosens gradually. Calm fills awareness. Confidence remains steady. You guide tomorrow. Father, trusting you anchors our hearts in the certainty that your plans will not fail. Psalm 33:11 reminds us that your plans stand firm forever. Trust steadies expectation. Fear dissolves slowly. Peace governs our hearts. Hope remains alive. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you teaches our hearts to remain deeply settled, even when life enters seasons that stretch our faith beyond familiar limits. Because true trust is refined when certainty is absent. Psalm 9:10 reminds us that those who know your name put their trust in you because you have never forsaken those who seek you. Trust becomes an anchor rather than an emotion. We learn to stand firm even when circumstances shift. Anxiety weakens as reliance deepens. Peace grows steadily through surrender. You remain faithful in every season. Father, when our thoughts grow heavy from prolonged waiting and unanswered questions, you invite us to release mental strain and rest in the assurance of your wisdom. Proverbs 19:21 reminds us that many plans exist in the human heart, but your purpose prevails. Trust frees us from obsessing over outcomes. Calm returns when control is surrendered. Perspective widens through faith. Our hearts grow lighter. You remain sovereign. Lord, trusting you reshapes how we view moments of vulnerability, teaching us that weakness is not failure, but an invitation for divine strength. 2 Corinthians 12:9 reminds us that your grace is sufficient and your power is made perfect in weakness. Trust allows honesty without shame. Dependence replaces self-reliance. Strength manifests quietly. Confidence grows inwardly. You uphold us gently. Father, when emotional fatigue threatens our endurance, you renew strength through patient trust rather than forced effort. Isaiah 40:31 reminds us again that those who hope in you renew their strength. Renewal unfolds gradually. Trust sustains us during long stretches. Weariness loosens its grip. Energy returns steadily. You restore us. Lord, trusting you steadies our hearts when disappointment tempts us to withdraw or disengage emotionally. Psalm 47:11 reminds us that you delight in those who fear you and put their hope in you. Hope remains alive through trust. Discouragement loses influence. Courage returns slowly. Emotional openness becomes safe again. You receive us. Father, trusting you protects our hearts from fear-driven decisions that lead to regret and confusion. Proverbs 14:15 reminds us that the wise consider their steps carefully. Trust encourages reflection over impulse. Peace confirms direction. Clarity replaces urgency. Confidence builds gradually. You guide wisely. Lord, trusting you renews perseverance when progress feels invisible and effort feels unrewarded. Hebrews 10:36 reminds us that endurance is necessary to receive what you have promised. Trust fuels commitment. Faith remains active during delay. Strength matures quietly. Hope stays alive. You honor perseverance. Father, trusting you calms inner restlessness when we feel pressured to prove ourselves or justify our worth. Galatians 2:20 reminds us that our life is hidden in you. Identity rests securely in truth. Trust silences insecurity. Confidence grows from belonging. Peace replaces striving. You affirm us. Lord, trusting you steadies us during seasons of internal growth, when refinement feels uncomfortable and unfamiliar. Psalm 66:12 reminds us that you bring us through difficulty into abundance. Trust embraces process. Growth unfolds quietly. Resistance fades gradually. Strength increases inwardly. You refine us with purpose. Father, trusting you softens our hearts toward others when relationships require patience and grace. Romans 12:10 encourages sincere love and honor. Trust allows compassion to override frustration. Listening replaces defensiveness. Healing becomes possible. Peace governs interaction. You shape our character. Lord, trusting you guards our minds when fear attempts to magnify future uncertainty. Psalm 112:7 reminds us again that hearts fixed in trust will not fear bad news. Trust stabilizes thought patterns. Calm replaces panic. Confidence grows steadily. Peace becomes consistent. You remain our security. Father, trusting you restores emotional balance when expectations clash with reality. Psalm 37:4 reminds us that delighting in you reshapes desire. Trust realigns priorities. Disappointment loses control. Contentment grows quietly. Joy resurfaces gently. You satisfy deeply. Lord, trusting you renews courage when fear of failure threatens momentum. Joshua 1:7 reminds us again to be strong and courageous through obedience. Trust strengthens resolve. Fear retreats gradually. Confidence stabilizes movement. Purpose becomes clear. You empower us. Father, trusting you teaches us patience when answers unfold slowly and clarity arrives in stages. Psalm 25:9 reminds us that you guide the humble. Humility welcomes wisdom. Trust sustains waiting. Peace fills uncertainty. Understanding grows gently. You instruct faithfully. Lord, trusting you protects our peace when external conditions remain unstable and unpredictable. John 16:33 reminds us again that peace exists even amid trouble. Trust anchors calm internally. Anxiety loses authority. Courage remains steady. Hope persists. You have overcome. Father, trusting you nurtures gratitude when blessings feel subtle rather than dramatic. Psalm 341 encourages continual praise. Gratitude deepens trust. Perspective shifts gently. Contentment grows. Joy becomes accessible. You fill our hearts. Lord, trusting you steadies us during seasons of transition that challenge our comfort and familiarity. Isaiah 43:2 reminds us again of your presence through change. Trust reassures continuity. Fear diminishes gradually. Confidence builds step by step. Peace confirms direction. You remain constant. Father, trusting you restores emotional strength when weariness begins to dull passion and motivation. Psalm 73:26 reminds us that you are the strength of our heart. Trust sustains inner energy. Renewal unfolds gradually. Hope remains alive. Strength returns quietly. You uphold us. Lord, trusting you guards our hearts from despair when past failures attempt to define future outcomes. Proverbs 28:13 reminds us that confession and trust lead to mercy. Trust releases shame. Healing flows freely. Confidence rebuilds steadily. Forward motion resumes. You restore us. Father, trusting you calms fear related to provision and future needs. Matthew 6:26 reminds us again of your attentive care. Trust quiets financial anxiety. Gratitude replaces worry. Assurance grows steadily. Peace settles deeply. You provide faithfully. Lord, trusting you anchors our hearts when spiritual growth feels internal rather than visible. Psalm 92:12 reminds us that growth occurs even when unseen. Trust embraces hidden progress. Patience strengthens faith. Hope remains active. Peace fills the process. You cultivate maturity. Father, trusting you protects our hope when voices of doubt attempt to overshadow truth. Romans 8:31 reminds us again that if you are for us, nothing can prevail against us. Trust silences fear. Confidence strengthens. Assurance becomes firm. Peace remains steady. You defend us. Lord, trusting you allows us to rest fully in the present moment without fear of tomorrow. Psalm 118:24 reminds us again to rejoice in today. Trust simplifies perspective. Anxiety loosens gradually. Calm fills awareness. Confidence remains strong. You hold time. Father, trusting you reassures us that your plans remain intact despite uncertainty along the path. Isaiah 14:24 reminds us that what you plan will stand. Trust steadies expectation. Fear dissolves slowly. Peace governs our hearts. Hope remains alive. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you teaches our hearts to remain grounded when life feels unstable and familiar anchors seem to shift, because faith is not built on predictability, but on your unchanging nature. Psalm 18:2 reminds us that you are our rock, fortress, and deliverer, standing firm when everything else feels uncertain. Trust steadies our emotions when circumstances fluctuate. We learn to lean on what does not move. Fear weakens as confidence in you strengthens. Peace settles deeper with each act of surrender. You remain our foundation. Father, when our minds grow tired from carrying unanswered questions, you invite us to release the burden of needing to know everything at once. Job 42 reminds us that no purpose of yours can be thwarted, even when understanding is limited. Trust frees us from mental exhaustion. Curiosity yields to confidence. Calm replaces restless speculation. Our thoughts grow quieter. You remain in control. Lord, trusting you reshapes how we face moments of loss, teaching us that loss does not erase purpose, but often refines it. Psalm 34:19 reminds us that though the righteous face many troubles, you deliver them from them all. Trust keeps hope alive through grief. Healing begins gently. Strength returns gradually. Perspective widens through faith. You restore what pain attempts to steal. Father, trusting you renews courage when fear of repeating past mistakes tries to restrain forward movement. Isaiah 43:19 reminds us that you are doing a new thing even now. Trust allows us to step forward without being bound by yesterday. Confidence grows slowly, shame loses influence, hope regains momentum. You lead us into renewal. Lord, trusting you guards our hearts when emotions fluctuate unpredictably and inner balance feels fragile. Psalm 55:16 reminds us that when we call on you, you save us. Trust anchors us during emotional waves. Stability increases with surrender. Calm becomes familiar again. Strength steadies our reactions. You answer faithfully. Father, trusting you teaches us patience when spiritual growth feels slower than expected. Galatians 6:9 reminds us not to grow weary in doing good, because a harvest will come in due time. Trust sustains consistency. Faith remains active during delay. Discouragement loses power. Perseverance matures quietly. You reward faithfulness. Lord, trusting you also softens our hearts toward ourselves when self-criticism threatens peace. Psalm 103:14 reminds us that you know our frame and remember we are dust. Trust allows compassion toward imperfection. Grace replaces harsh judgment. Healing becomes possible. Confidence rebuilds gently. You understand us completely. Father, trusting you steadies us when we face decisions that carry weight and consequence. Proverbs 3:5 reminds us again to trust you with all our heart and not lean on our own understanding. Trust quiets fear of missteps. Peace confirms direction gradually. Confidence strengthens with each step. Clarity unfolds over time. You guide us wisely. Lord, trusting you protects our peace when comparison tries to undermine contentment. Psalm 16:5 reminds us that you are our portion and our cup. Trust redirects focus inward. Gratitude grows stronger. Joy becomes personal rather than competitive. Satisfaction deepens. You provide what we need. Father, trusting you renews emotional strength when responsibilities feel heavy and unending. Matthew 11:28 reminds us again that you invite the weary to find rest. Trust releases burdens we were never meant to carry alone. Relief unfolds gradually. Energy returns steadily. Peace replaces pressure. You sustain us. Lord, trusting you reframes seasons of obscurity as times of preparation rather than insignificance. Colossians 3:3 reminds us that our lives are hidden with you. Trust values unseen growth. Confidence remains steady without recognition. Faith deepens quietly. Purpose matures inwardly. You see what others do not. Father, trusting you steadies our hearts when relationships require patience, humility, and forgiveness. Ephesians 4:2 reminds us to bear with one another in love. Trust fosters gentleness. Reactivity fades gradually. Understanding grows through grace. Healing becomes possible. You teach us love. Lord, trusting you guards our minds when fear of the future tries to dominate thought patterns. Psalm 112:8 reminds us that hearts, trusting you, are secure. Trust stabilizes mental focus. Calm replaces dread. Confidence strengthens. Peace becomes consistent. You remain our security. Father, trusting you renews hope when setbacks attempt to define our worth or direction. Proverbs 24:16 reminds us that even after falling, rising is possible. Trust lifts us from discouragement. Confidence rebuilds slowly. Momentum returns. Faith regains clarity. You restore progress. Lord, trusting you teaches us to embrace discipline without resentment. Hebrews 12:11 reminds us that discipline produces a harvest of righteousness and peace. Trust reframes correction as care. Growth deepens through humility. Resistance fades gradually. Wisdom increases. You refine lovingly. Father, trusting you calms fear related to provision and future stability. Psalm 23:1 reminds us that with you as our shepherd, we lack nothing. Trust quiets financial anxiety. Gratitude replaces worry. Assurance grows steadily. Peace fills our thoughts. You provide faithfully. Lord, trusting you restores joy when routine threatens to dull our spirit. Nehemiah 8:10 reminds us that joy in you is our strength. Trust reconnects us to joy. Perspective shifts gently. Lightness returns. Motivation renews. You refresh our hearts. Father, trusting you steadies us when inner growth challenges comfort zones and familiar patterns. Isaiah 48:17 reminds us that you teach us what is best. Trust welcomes instruction. Resistance loosens gradually. Growth feels purposeful. Confidence strengthens. You instruct gently. Lord, trusting you protects our hope when external circumstances remain unchanged longer than expected. Romans 12:12 reminds us to be joyful in hope and patient in affliction. Trust sustains optimism. Faith remains active. Peace stabilizes emotions. Endurance matures quietly. You remain faithful. Father, trusting you renews emotional resilience when weariness tries to settle deeply. Psalm 138:3 reminds us that you strengthen us within. Trust sustains inner resolve. Fatigue loosens gradually. Strength returns steadily. Hope remains alive. You uphold us. Lord, trusting you steadies our hearts when silence feels louder than answers. Lamentations 3:31 reminds us that you do not cast off forever. Trust holds faith during quiet seasons. Assurance deepens. Peace fills the stillness. Confidence remains intact. You remain near. Father, trusting you protects our identity when doubt tries to redefine us through past failures. Romans 8:1 reminds us, again, there is no condemnation in you. Trust restores dignity. Shame loses power. Confidence rebuilds. Forward movement becomes possible. You redeem fully. Lord, trusting you allows us to live fully present without fear of what lies ahead. Psalm 118:6 reminds us that we need not fear what people or circumstances can do. Trust simplifies our outlook. Anxiety loosens its grip. Calm fills awareness. Confidence remains steady. You walk with us. Father, trusting you anchors our hearts in the certainty that your purposes will prevail, regardless of temporary uncertainty. Proverbs 16:4 reminds us that you have made everything for its purpose. Trust steadies expectation. Fear dissolves gradually. Peace governs our hearts. Hope remains alive. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you teaches our hearts to rest fully, even when the journey has been long and the weight of waiting has tested our patience, because faith reaches maturity when endurance has done its work. Psalm 66:9 reminds us that you preserve our lives and keep our feet from slipping, even when the path feels uncertain. Trust becomes our steady posture rather than a temporary reaction. We no longer rush the process or resist the pace. Calm replaces striving as surrender deepens. Peace settles into our spirit. You have sustained us faithfully. Father, as we look back over seasons that once felt overwhelming, you reveal how your hand was guiding us, even when clarity was absent. Psalm 77:19 reminds us that your path led through the sea, though your footprints were unseen. Trust allows reflection without regret. Gratitude grows where fear once lived. Confidence strengthens as perspective widens. Healing completes what pain began. You were present all along. Lord, trusting you restores wholeness where fear once fragmented our thoughts and emotions, because truth has slowly replaced uncertainty. John 8:32 reminds us that truth sets us free, not instantly, but completely. Trust frees our minds from constant vigilance. Peace becomes natural rather than forced. Emotional balance returns steadily. Strength feels grounded. You have brought us freedom. Father, trusting you anchors our hearts when we realize that control was never the source of security, but relationship was. Psalm 91:4 reminds us that your faithfulness is our shield and rampart. Trust redirects our dependence from effort to presence. Anxiety fades where assurance grows. Safety becomes internal. Rest feels earned through surrender. You remain our refuge. Lord, trusting you renews joy when we recognize how far you have carried us beyond what we thought possible. Psalm 26:3 reminds us that you have done great things for us, and joy follows recognition. Trust opens our eyes to progress. Gratitude replaces exhaustion. Celebration emerges quietly. Hope feels lighter. You deserve our praise. Father, trusting you allows closure to seasons marked by uncertainty and strain, because peace now governs where worry once ruled. Philippians 4:7 reminds us that your peace guards our hearts and minds beyond understanding. Trust seals our hearts with assurance. Rest becomes consistent. Sleep comes easily. Thoughts quiet naturally. You grant peace. Lord, trusting you strengthens our resolve to continue forward without fear of repeating old patterns. Isaiah 43:18 reminds us not to dwell on former things. Trust releases attachment to the past. Momentum feels safe again. Confidence builds steadily. Vision feels renewed. You lead us forward. Father, trusting you deepens humility as we acknowledge that every victory was sustained by your grace. 1 Corinthians 15:10 reminds us that grace empowered every step. Trust keeps pride from rising. Gratitude grounds our progress. Perspective remains clear. Dependence feels healthy. You receive the glory. Lord, trusting you reassures us that nothing learned through hardship was wasted or meaningless. Romans 8:18 reminds us that present struggles cannot compare to future glory. Trust redeems memory. Pain softens into wisdom. Strength feels purposeful. Understanding deepens. You transform suffering. Father, trusting you strengthens patience as we recognize that growth continues even beyond this season. Psalm 92:13 reminds us that those planted in you continue to flourish. Trust commits us to long-term faithfulness. We release the need for constant affirmation. Contentment stabilizes our emotions. Hope remains alive. You nurture growth. Lord, trusting you restores confidence when we step into new responsibilities shaped by past refinement. Proverbs 16:3 reminds us to commit our work to you. Trust steadies our efforts. Anxiety no longer drives performance. Focus remains clear. Peace accompanies action. You establish our plans. Father, trusting you calms fear about the future as we recognize that you already stand there waiting. Isaiah 41:13 reminds us that you hold our hand and say not to fear. Trust dissolves uncertainty. Courage becomes steady. Security feels assured. Calm governs our thoughts. You walk with us. Lord, trusting you heals lingering wounds left by disappointment or unmet expectations. Psalm 147:3 reminds us that you heal the broken-hearted and bind their wounds. Trust invites restoration. Pain releases its grip. Strength returns gently. Hope rises again. You mend us fully. Father, trusting you nurtures gratitude in ordinary moments that once felt insignificant. Psalm 118:24 reminds us to rejoice in this day. Trust sharpens awareness. Joy emerges in simplicity. Contentment grows naturally. Peace remains present. You bless each moment. Lord, trusting you anchors our identity in truth rather than in circumstance or outcome. Colossians 2:10 reminds us that we are complete in you. Trust stabilizes self-worth. Comparison loses power. Confidence remains steady. Peace flows inwardly. You define us. Father, trusting you strengthens faith as we recognize that endurance has produced maturity within us. James 1:4 reminds us that perseverance makes us complete. Trust celebrates progress without pride. Growth feels authentic. Balance replaces striving. Confidence remains grounded. You have matured us. Lord, trusting you renews emotional clarity when life begins to feel lighter and less burdened. Psalm 34:8 reminds us to taste and see your goodness. Trust invites enjoyment without fear. Peace becomes familiar. Joy settles deeply. Gratitude flows freely. You are good. Father, trusting you steadies our hearts as we step forward with lessons learned and faith strengthened. Psalm 21:8 reminds us that you watch over our coming and going. Trust confirms protection, confidence accompanies movement. Calm replaces hesitation, security feels complete. You guard our steps. Lord, trusting you restores rest, when striving finally gives way to surrender. Hebrews 4:9 reminds us that rest remains for your people. Trust enters that rest fully. Effort relaxes, peace settles deeply, strength renews quietly. You grant rest. Father, trusting you reassures us that nothing ahead will surprise you or overwhelm your care. Psalm 139:5 reminds us that you surround us on every side. Trust releases future anxiety. Assurance remains strong. Calm fills awareness. Confidence stands firm. You are ahead of us. Lord, trusting you allows our hearts to remain open and hopeful as new seasons unfold. Proverbs 23:18 reminds us that hope will not be cut off. Trust sustains expectation. Faith remains alive. Peace governs emotions. Joy anticipates what is coming. You fulfill promises. Father, trusting you seals our hearts with certainty that your faithfulness will continue beyond this moment. Lamentations 3:23 reminds us that your mercies are new every morning. Trust rests in consistency. Fear dissolves completely. Peace reigns. Hope stands firm. You are unchanging. Lord, trusting you brings us to a place of quiet confidence, where worry no longer dominates our thoughts or decisions. Psalm 46:10 reminds us to be still and know that you are God. Trust embraces stillness. Calm defines our posture. Faith remains unwavering. Peace fills every space. You reign supreme. Father, trusting you affirms that everything we have walked through has led us exactly where we need to be under your care. Jeremiah 29:11 reminds us one final time that your plans are for hope and a future. Trust completes its work within us. Fear has no voice here. Peace governs our hearts completely. Hope stands unshaken. Everything will be fine because you are faithful. Lord, trusting you continues to deepen within us as we learn that faith is not a destination we arrive at, but a posture we live from every single day, even after long seasons of testing. Psalm 27 reminds us that some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. Trust reshapes our instincts over time. We no longer react from fear, but respond from assurance. Calm becomes our default rather than panic. Confidence settles quietly in our spirit. You remain our true source of security. Father, as life keeps unfolding with its mix of calm and challenge, you teach us that trust must be renewed daily, rather than assumed once and for all. Lamentations 3:22-23 reminds us that your mercies are new every morning. Trust becomes a daily choice. Yesterday's victories do not replace today's dependence. Humility keeps our hearts aligned. Peace grows through consistency. You meet us every morning. Lord, trusting you allows us to walk forward without replaying every past struggle, because memory no longer controls direction when healing has done its work. Isaiah 61:7 reminds us that you give a double portion instead of former shame. Trust reframes our history. Pain becomes wisdom rather than weight. Confidence grows from understanding. Joy feels deserved, not fragile. You redeem what was broken. Father, trusting you steadies our hearts when the future begins to ask more responsibility from us than before. Luke 16:10 reminds us that faithfulness in small things prepares us for greater things. Trust matures through stewardship. Fear of inadequacy fades. Strength grows with obedience. Peace confirms readiness. You equip us for what is next. Lord, trusting you protects our minds when unexpected challenges appear, even after long seasons of peace. Psalm 112:6 reminds us that the righteous will never be shaken. Trust keeps us from panic. Stability remains internal. Perspective stays grounded. Calm governs reaction. You remain unmovable. Father, trusting you teaches us to rest, even while actively moving forward, because striving is no longer confused with progress. Exodus 14:14 reminds us that you fight for us while we remain at peace. Trust allows effort without anxiety. Balance replaces exhaustion. Focus remains clear. Strength flows steadily. You work on our behalf. Lord, trusting you reshapes our prayer life, from desperation to communion, because relationship has replaced fear-driven pleading. Psalm 145:18 reminds us that you are near to all who call on you in truth. Trust deepens intimacy. Confidence replaces urgency. Peace fills conversation with you. Assurance becomes natural. You listen attentively. Father, trusting you steadies us when growth exposes areas still being refined within us. Proverbs 4:18 reminds us that the path of the righteous grows brighter. Trust welcomes refinement without resistance. Growth feels hopeful rather than threatening. Wisdom increases gradually. Confidence stays grounded. You continue shaping us. Lord, trusting you restores balance when success or stability tempt us to rely on ourselves again. Deuteronomy 8:18 reminds us that you give the power to gain strength. Trust keeps gratitude alive. Pride loses its foothold. Dependence remains healthy. Peace stays anchored. You remain our source. Father, trusting you helps us navigate relationships with greater grace, patience, and discernment than before. James 1:19 reminds us to be quick to listen and slow to speak. Trust slows reactions. Wisdom shapes responses. Understanding grows steadily. Peace strengthens bonds. You teach us maturity. Lord, trusting you protects our joy when circumstances do not meet our expectations exactly as planned. Habakkuk 3:17-18 reminds us that joy can exist even without visible fruit. Trust anchors joy internally. Gratitude does not depend on outcome. Hope remains alive. Peace steadies emotion. You remain our joy. Father, trusting you renews emotional resilience when old fears attempt to resurface without warning. Psalm 91:14 reminds us that you rescue those who trust in you. Trust silences returning fear. Confidence regains ground. Calm reestablishes itself. Security deepens again. You are our refuge. Lord, trusting you teaches us to measure progress by faithfulness rather than speed. Ecclesiastes 7:8 reminds us that the end of a matter is better than its beginning. Trust values endurance. Patience feels purposeful. Hope remains steady. Peace accompanies the journey. You honor completion. Father, trusting you keeps our hearts soft when life begins to feel routine again, after intense seasons of growth. Colossians 3:15 reminds us to let your peace rule our hearts. Trust preserves sensitivity. Gratitude stays active. Joy remains accessible. Calm becomes stable. You reign within us. Lord, trusting you renews confidence when we step into unfamiliar roles shaped by past refinement. Psalm 138:8 reminds us that you will fulfill your purpose for us. Trust affirms calling. Fear of inadequacy fades. Strength aligns with purpose. Peace confirms direction. You complete what you start. Father, trusting you protects our peace when the world around us grows louder and more demanding. John 10:27 reminds us that we recognize your voice above others. Trust filters distraction. Focus remains clear. Calm resists pressure. Confidence stays intact. You guide us clearly. Lord, trusting you strengthens humility when we realize how much grace carried us through seasons we could not survive alone. 1 Peter 5:6 reminds us that humility leads to exaltation in due time. Trust keeps us grounded. Gratitude shapes character. Pride dissolves quietly. Peace remains steady. You lift us at the right time. Father, trusting you stabilizes our emotions when unexpected changes require flexibility rather than resistance. Proverbs 16:3 reminds us again to commit everything to you. Trust adapts without fear. Confidence remains steady. Calm replaces rigidity. Wisdom guides response. You direct our steps. Lord, trusting you renews joy in ordinary obedience, even when nothing dramatic seems to be happening. Luke 11:28 commands us that blessing comes through hearing and keeping your word. Trust values consistency. Faithfulness feels rewarding. Peace grows quietly. Satisfaction deepens. You bless obedience. Father, trusting you restores clarity when emotions threaten to blur judgment. Psalm 119:105 reminds us that your word is a lamp to our feet. Trust illuminates steps. Confusion fades gradually. Confidence returns. Direction feels safe. You guide us forward. Lord, trusting you anchors our hope when the future feels open-ended rather than defined. Romans 15:13 reminds us that hope overflows through trust in you. Trust sustains optimism. Fear loses authority. Peace steadies expectation. Joy anticipates goodness. You fill us with hope. Father, trusting you allows us to remain calm when outcomes are still unfolding beyond our understanding. Psalm 46:5 reminds us that you help at the break of day. Trust holds patience. Anxiety loosens gradually. Confidence remains firm. Peace governs the waiting. You act at the right time. Lord, trusting you teaches us that maturity is not the absence of challenge, but the presence of peace within challenge. James 3:17 reminds us that wisdom is peace-loving and gentle. Trust reflects wisdom. Calm replaces reaction. Strength remains steady. Faith stands mature. You shape our growth. Father, trusting you reassures us that even continued growth will always be met with continued grace. 2 Corinthians reminds us that your grace abounds toward us. Trust rests in abundance. Fear dissolves completely. Peace fills every area. Confidence remains unshaken. You supply all we need. Lord, trusting you keeps our hearts aligned with truth as life continues to unfold beyond what we imagined. Psalm 33:20 reminds us that our hope is in you. Trust anchors expectation. Faith remains alive. Peace governs our hearts. Confidence stays steady. You remain faithful forever. Lord, trusting you continues to mature our hearts as we realize that faith is not proven only in crisis, but also sustained in seasons of stability and quiet obedience. Psalm 37:7 reminds us to be still before you and wait patiently, even when nothing dramatic seems to be happening. Trust learns to remain steady without constant reassurance. Our confidence no longer depends on visible change. Peace becomes durable rather than emotional. Calm shapes our daily posture. You remain worthy of trust at all times. Father, trusting you teaches us that consistency matters more than intensity when it comes to spiritual growth and inner transformation. Luke 16:10 reminds us again that faithfulness in small things leads to greater responsibility. Trust honors the unseen work. Patience replaces impatience. Progress unfolds quietly over time. Hope stays alive without pressure. You value steady obedience. Lord, trusting you guards our hearts when comfort tempts us to become spiritually complacent or inattentive. Proverbs 4:23 reminds us to guard our hearts diligently. Trust keeps us alert without anxiety. Awareness sharpens gently. Gratitude remains active. Peace does not dull purpose. You keep us aligned. Father, trusting you stabilizes our emotions when life feels repetitive, and we wonder if growth is still happening. Psalm 92:14 reminds us that those planted in you still bear fruit in season. Trust embraces long-term growth. Discouragement fades slowly. Confidence returns inwardly. Peace affirms progress. You continue cultivating us. Lord, trusting you reshapes our understanding of success, teaching us that obedience often matters more than recognition. Colossians 3:23 reminds us to work wholeheartedly. As for you, trust frees us from approval seeking. Contentment grows quietly. Motivation remains pure. Joy becomes internal. You see every effort. Father, trusting you strengthens humility when stability returns, and pride quietly tries to re-enter. Deuteronomy 8:11 reminds us not to forget you in seasons of abundance. Trust keeps gratitude alive. Perspective remains grounded. Dependence stays healthy. Peace remains steady. You remain our source. Lord, trusting you teaches us to maintain emotional balance when responsibilities increase and expectations rise. Matthew 11:30 reminds us that your yoke is easy and your burden is light. Trust prevents overload. Calm governs effort. Focus remains clear. Strength flows steadily. You carry the weight with us, Father. Trusting you renews patience when outcomes unfold slower than we imagined, even after long periods of preparation. Psalm 27:14 encourages us again to wait for you with courage. Trust steadies anticipation. Anxiety loosens its grip. Peace fills the waiting. Confidence remains intact. You act in perfect timing. Lord, trusting you softens our hearts toward others when differences surface and understanding requires effort. Romans 15:5 reminds us that you give endurance and encouragement. Trust nurtures empathy. Reactivity fades gradually. Grace replaces judgment. Peace strengthens relationships. You teach us unity. Father, trusting you protects our minds when unexpected interruptions disrupt carefully laid plans. Proverbs 16:9 reminds us again that you establish our steps. Trust adapts without fear. Flexibility replaces frustration. Calm confirms direction. Confidence remains steady. You guide even interruptions. Lord, trusting you renews joy when daily routines begin to feel ordinary and predictable. Psalm 118:24 reminds us again that each day is a gift. Trust awakens gratitude. Joy emerges quietly. Perspective shifts gently. Contentment deepens. You bless the ordinary. Father, trusting you strengthens our ability to rest emotionally, even while responsibilities remain active. Hebrews 4:10 reminds us that resting in you completes striving. Trust releases inner tension. Peace settles deeply. Energy renews steadily. Calm governs our spirit. You grant rest. Lord, trusting you guards our hearts when comparison threatens satisfaction with our own journey. Galatians 6:4 reminds us to test our own work. Trust keeps focus personal. Gratitude replaces envy. Joy remains authentic. Peace strengthens confidence. You guide individual paths. Father, trusting you renews resilience when small setbacks occur that test patience rather than faith. Proverbs 24:10 reminds us not to lose heart in difficulty. Trust sustains perseverance. Discouragement loses influence. Strength remains present. Hope continues forward. You build endurance. Lord, trusting you teaches us discernment when opportunities arise that require wisdom rather than impulse. James 1:5 reminds us that you give wisdom generously. Trust invites counsel. Clarity unfolds gradually. Peace confirms decisions. Confidence grows steadily. You guide our choices. Father, trusting you steadies us when emotions fluctuate without clear reason, reminding us that stability comes from truth, not feeling. Psalm 112:7 reminds us again that trusting hearts are not afraid. Trust anchors emotion. Calm returns gently. Perspective stabilizes. Peace becomes reliable. You remain our anchor. Lord, trusting you restores joy when laughter returns after long seasons of seriousness and struggle. Ecclesiastes 3:4 reminds us there is a time to laugh. Trust allows enjoyment without guilt. Lightness feels safe. Gratitude grows naturally. Peace remains present. You delight in our joy. Father, trusting you strengthens our spiritual maturity when we begin to respond wisely rather than react emotionally. Proverbs 15:1 reminds us that gentle answers turn away anger. Trust governs response. Wisdom shapes words. Calm replaces defensiveness. Peace preserves connection. You teach restraint. Lord, trusting you protects our hope when life does not accelerate as quickly as expected. Habakkuk 2:3 reminds us again that vision waits for the appointed time. Trust sustains patience. Expectation remains alive. Peace steady as anticipation. Faith does not waver. You fulfill promises. Father, trusting you renews emotional clarity when we pause to reflect rather than rush forward. Psalm 19:65 reminds us that those who love your word have great peace. Trust deepens reflection. Insight grows gently. Calm sharpens understanding. Confidence becomes clear. You illuminate our path. Lord, trusting you allows us to remain grounded when praise or affirmation comes unexpectedly. Proverbs 27:21 reminds us that character is tested by praise. Trust keeps humility intact. Gratitude redirects attention. Pride loses influence. Peace remains stable. You shape integrity. Father, trusting you steadies our hearts when new seasons begin quietly rather than dramatically. Isaiah 60:22 reminds us that you work in your time. Trust honors gradual beginnings. Hope grows patiently. Peace accompanies progress. Confidence remains steady. You oversee transition. Lord, trusting you renews strength when faithfulness continues without visible reward. Hebrews 6:12 reminds us to inherit promises through faith and patience. Trust fuels endurance. Weariness loosens gradually. Hope stays alive. Peace steadies effort. You reward persistence. Father, trusting you reassures us that no effort given in faith is ever overlooked. Psalm 138:8 reminds us again that you fulfill your purpose for us. Trust affirms significance. Confidence strengthens inwardly. Peace replaces doubt. Assurance becomes firm. You complete what you begin. Lord, trusting you anchors our hearts as life continues forward, with both known and unknown paths ahead. Psalm 33:11 reminds us that your plans stand firm forever. Trust steadies expectation. Fear dissolves slowly. Peace governs our hearts. Hope remains alive. You remain faithful always. Amen.